You might imagine that the life of a medieval nun was one of orderly rhythms. You might picture quiet mornings in cold stone halls, the faint echo of steps across worn floors, and the gentle rising of voices in prayer. For many women, that was indeed the shape of their days. Yet, every rule, no matter how strict, invites someone to bend it. This is where Sister Agnes enters your thoughts, a woman whose name has survived not because she was holy or heroic, but because she was difficult to ignore. Her story begins in a small priory near the edge of a forest, a place that rarely received visitors. It was built in the early medieval period, during a time when stone was quarried by hand, and the walls of religious houses rose slowly. The priory was not wealthy, its farmland was modest, its gardens unimpressive, and its sisters spent much of their time managing the chores that allowed the house to survive from season to season. You can imagine the heavy wooden buckets they carried from the well, the rough cloth of their habits brushing against their ankles, and the constant presence of cold air in winter months. Sister Agnes was 16 when she arrived. Her family was not noble, but they were tired of managing her. Medieval households depended on discipline and obedience, and Agnes did not provide either. Her mother said she had a difficult tongue. Her father said she had too many ideas for someone her age. Her brothers simply avoided her altogether. Sending her to a priory was not a punishment. It was a solution. Life inside the walls should have shaped her into someone quieter. Instead, she observed everything. She noticed when the bread was overbaked. She noticed when the wells dipped lower than usual. She noticed when one sister hid extra parchment for personal notes. Her mind held these things not with judgment, but with curiosity. She had a habit of asking questions, and this habit irritated the older sisters. The prioress at the time, Sister Marjorie, believed that rules were the backbone of spiritual life. She spent her days reinforcing schedules, correcting posture, and reminding the sisters that silence was not just a practice but a discipline. Agnes did not resist openly. Instead, she pushed against rules by asking why they existed. Why pray at these specific hours? Why eat only certain foods? Why was silence kept in some rooms but not others? Why was the orchard off limits during certain seasons? Her questions attracted attention that she did not intend. Younger novices listened to her with curiosity, as if she were saying aloud what they had never dared to ask. Older sisters sighed deeply each time she spoke. In a place designed for repetition and humility, someone with restless thoughts could disrupt the quiet balance. Despite this, Agnes adapted to some parts of the daily routine. She learned to mend robes with steady stitches. She learned the rhythm of chants, even if she occasionally lost focus halfway through a long recitation. She learned which herbs to gather from the garden to treat fevers, and she learned how to tend the priory's sheep when the shepherd was occupied elsewhere. Her hands became capable, even if her mind wandered. There were days when she behaved as though she belonged. She helped wash linens beside the stream, and carried baskets of vegetables into the kitchen. Yet even on peaceful days, there was something in her that resisted stillness. In the evenings when the others rested, she often sat beside the narrow window in her small chamber, watching the last light fade behind the treetops. You might imagine her fingers tracing patterns on the windowsill, her mind drifting into questions she could not speak aloud. The priory had few visitors, but occasionally a traveling monk or local villager would bring news. Agnes listened closely to these conversations. She learned about distant market towns, about disputes over farmland, about travelers who had lost their way in the forest. The world beyond the walls fascinated her in a way that made her seem distracted from the life she had entered. Her first recorded act of disobedience was simple. During a period of restricted movement, when the orchard was closed for seasonal protection, Agnes slipped through the fence. She wanted to see whether the apples had begun to ripen. This small act became the center of a heated discussion in the chapter house. The prioress lectured her before the assembled sisters, reminding her that obedience was the foundation of their vows. Agnes stood silently through the reprimand, but her eyes drifted toward the doorway, as if she were already thinking of something else. For the next year, she caused more concern. She spoke too freely, questioned too openly, and wandered too often. She was not malicious. She was simply curious. Yet even harmless curiosity could appear dangerous in an environment designed to maintain order. Records kept by visiting clerics described her as lively, unruly, and prone to unstructured thought. In the margins of one visitor's report, a single line survives: "She is not suited to the quiet of this house." Still, the priory needed capable hands. They assigned Agnes to the kitchens for a season, and then to the garden. Later, she was placed in charge of maintaining the candles, a tedious job that required melting and reshaping wax. She found no satisfaction in repetitive tasks, and the sisters soon realized that the candles she made were sometimes uneven or overly thin. Even so, no one could deny her determination. She tried, even if she did not always succeed. One cold winter morning, something changed. Agnes discovered that an older sister named Edith had been hiding extra bread rations. The priory had limited food, and this type of selfishness endangered everyone. Instead of reporting it, Agnes confronted her privately. Edith reacted with anger, and the confrontation became loud enough to draw the attention of others. What should have been a quiet correction turned into a public dispute. This incident marked the beginning of Sister Agnes's reputation as the priory's most troublesome member. She was seen as someone who disturbed harmony, someone whose presence made others uneasy. She was not cruel, but she was unpredictable, and unpredictability challenged the structure of their days. Yet, despite every problem she caused, there was something compelling about her. Younger novices admired her honesty. Some older sisters, though frustrated, admitted privately that she noticed problems before anyone else. When livestock fell ill, she was the first to spot the symptoms. When a roof tile slipped after a storm, she pointed it out before the next rain arrived. She was disruptive, yes, but she was also observant. In this tension between order and restless curiosity, Sister Agnes continued to shape her place within the priory. She never fully belonged, but she never fully rejected the life either. She lived somewhere in between, suspended between obedience and inquiry. Her story, however, was far from complete. The incidents that would cause her to be remembered as one of medieval history's most troublesome nuns had not yet begun. For now, she was simply a young woman who asked too many questions in a world that valued quiet acceptance. And as you picture her standing near the priory gate in the pale light of early morning, you may wonder what happens when a restless mind finally reaches the breaking point of a rigid life. What events would unfold when curiosity collided fully with discipline? And how would the sisters around her respond when the quiet walls could no longer contain her thoughts? When you imagine the slow passing of time inside a medieval priory, you might think of days blending softly into one another. Prayers marked the morning, meals divided the day, and silence filled the long stretches between chores. For most of the sisters, each season looked similar to the last. But for Sister Agnes, every day brought another detail to observe and another question to ask. By the time a full year had passed after her arrival, she had already become a quiet source of tension within the house. Yet the most striking period of her life in the priory began during a turbulent spring, when the routines that once kept the community steady began to weaken. Long before anyone suspected the depth of the change, Agnes sensed that something in the air felt unsettled. You might picture her moving along the garden path, her eyes not on the ground but fixed on the clouds, watching them as though they hid the answer to a private puzzle she could not articulate. The year had begun with a colder winter than usual. The well water froze repeatedly, and the sisters had to break the surface each morning. The priory's food stores dwindled more quickly than expected. Several sheep grew ill, leaving the small flock weaker than it had been in earlier seasons. While the priories insisted that their hardship was nothing more than the will of the divine, Agnes saw the situation more practically. If the flock continued to decline and the garden failed to produce well, the priory would face shortages in the autumn. She spoke about these concerns during the evening meal, breaking a silence that was meant to continue until morning. Her voice startled several sisters, who looked up with surprise. The prioress reprimanded her immediately, reminding her that she was disrupting both the order of the house and the spiritual rhythm of the day. Yet even as she scolded her, a few older sisters exchanged quiet glances, because they too had noticed the same signs of trouble. In the days that followed, Agnes became increasingly attuned to every small shift. She watched the sheep with unusual intensity, and spent long evenings examining dried herbs from the storage room, checking for signs of rot. Her behavior irritated some sisters, who believed she was wasting time with needless analysis. But others, especially the younger novices, found comfort in the fact that someone was paying attention to the details that shaped their survival. The tension in the priory grew heavier when a traveling monk arrived. One afternoon, his robe was stained with dirt from long roads, and he carried a letter sealed with wax. Letters were rare, visitors were rarer. The message he brought had been sent from a larger religious house to the south, instructing priory leaders to review their internal practices. According to the letter, several small priories had been found to suffer from poor administrative management, which led to waste, miscommunication, and in some cases, scandal. The prioress gathered the community in the chapel and read the letter aloud. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes grew tense. After the reading, she announced that there would be several weeks of close observation of each sister's tasks. Records would be kept of food stores, candle supplies, prayer attendance, and every detail of daily life. To most sisters, this meant only that their already structured routines would become slightly more rigid, but to Agnes, the announcement stirred something deeper. She had felt the strain in the house long before the letter arrived. She believed that the priory could improve its survival strategies, and she wondered whether this new period of inspection might offer a chance for honest evaluation. However, the prioress had no intention of opening the floor to her questions. Instead, she assigned Agnes to work under Sister Adelina, the most disciplined member of the house, perhaps in the hope that constant supervision might temper her restless spirit. Sister Adelina was a woman of few words, but she believed completely in the order of monastic life. She woke before dawn with absolute consistency, and she performed each task with quiet precision. Working with her was like following a line drawn firmly across parchment. There was no deviation, no wandering thought, and no room for improvisation. On the first morning of their shared duties, Adelina explained the tasks in clear and simple terms. The candles would be counted. The storage room would be inspected. The herb garden would be checked for early signs of disease. Agnes listened with polite attention, though subtle impatience flickered across her expression. Throughout the day she tried to match Adelina's steadiness. She measured wax carefully and placed each candle in neat rows. She inspected the herb bundles for mold and discoloration, but her hands began to slow as her mind drifted toward questions that the strict routine could not contain. When she noticed that several of the lavender bundles hung too close together, she mentioned that the lack of space could lead to moisture buildup. Adelina nodded without emotion, and said only that the arrangement had always been this way. When Agnes pointed out that the candles varied slightly in thickness, Adelina replied that slight imperfections were not worth fretting over. The more Agnes tried to observe quietly, the more her thoughts pressed against the edges of silence. She continued to ask questions that she believed would help the community, but Adelina treated each question as a disruption. It became clear that the prioress had chosen this assignment not to help Agnes contribute, but to break her attention into manageable pieces. A breakthrough occurred one chilly morning, when Agnes examined the granary. The storage barrels held grain from the previous harvest, but she noticed something unusual. A faint trail of husks led from one barrel to the corner of the room. When she knelt to inspect the floor, she found tiny droppings that suggested the presence of rodents. She brought her concern to Adelina, who dismissed it as a seasonal inconvenience. Later that day, Agnes returned alone to the granary, carrying a small lantern. The dim glow illuminated details she had missed earlier. The droppings were scattered more widely than she first realized. The barrel lids were slightly askew, suggesting that rodents had been feeding during the night. If the grain supply continued to be compromised, the priory would face a significant shortage within a few months. As she stood there, lantern in hand, she felt the weight of decision settle upon her. She could report the problem privately to the prioress, and risk being accused of exaggeration, or she could confront the issue directly, even if it meant challenging the authority of those who believed she spoke too freely. She chose the latter. During the evening meeting, where the sisters gave brief reports on their tasks, Agnes stepped forward and described the condition of the granary. She spoke plainly, detailing the evidence, the risks, and the potential consequences. Her calm tone surprised many of the sisters. Even the prioress leaned slightly forward, listening with more interest than usual. But before Agnes could finish her explanation, Sister Adelina interrupted. She insisted that Agnes had overinterpreted a minor problem and accused her of creating unnecessary alarm. Adelina argued that such inspections were meant to strengthen discipline, not encourage wild speculation. Her voice remained steady, but her words struck the room like a quiet lash. The prioress hesitated before responding. She reminded Agnes that observations were welcomed only when they came through proper channels. She then dismissed the matter, instructing Adelina to recheck the granary on her own. Agnes lowered her gaze, but her silence carried a simmering frustration. The next morning, when Adelina returned from her inspection, she said nothing at first, but later that day, she asked Agnes to join her in the granary. When Agnes entered, she saw that the evidence had grown worse. The barrel lids were more heavily damaged, and fresh husks littered the floor. Adelina stood quietly for a long time, before admitting that Agnes had been correct. This private acknowledgement should have eased the tension. Instead, it deepened it. Adelina did not want to be wrong in public, and she did not want Agnes gaining influence among the sisters. Word of the problem spread quietly, as news often does in small communities. Some sisters began to watch Agnes with new respect. Others feared that her observations would disrupt the fragile calm of their daily life. The prioress, sensing an imbalance, decided to impose stricter control. She reassigned Agnes to the most monotonous duties, hoping repetition might finally soothe her questioning nature. For a while it seemed to work. Agnes attended prayers with unusual quiet. She scrubbed floors with deliberate patience. She carried water from the well without complaint. But inside her the quiet did not feel natural. It felt forced, like a lid placed on a simmering pot. The real turning point came when a second visitor arrived from the same southern religious house. This time it was not a traveling monk, but an official inspector sent to evaluate smaller communities. His presence caused immediate discomfort. His straightforward manner contrasted sharply with the softer rhythms of priory life. He requested detailed records, and the prioress complied. He inspected the garden, the granary, the kitchen, the sheep pens, and the library. He took notes on parchment with small, cramped letters, and eventually he spoke individually with several sisters. When he sat with Agnes, he expected little more than polite answers. Instead, she spoke honestly about the structural weaknesses she had noticed. She explained the grain situation. She mentioned the uneven candle supply. She even described the way younger novices struggled to understand certain tasks because older sisters preferred tradition over teaching. The inspector listened in silence. When she finished, he asked her only one question. Did she believe that the priory could improve its operations? Agnes replied that any community could improve if it looked closely at the small details that shaped daily survival. The inspector thanked her and left without offering any opinion, but his expression suggested that her words had struck a chord. When his final report arrived weeks later, the prioress gathered the community once more in the chapel to read it aloud. The report praised the devotion of the sisters and the simplicity of their life. But then, in calm and measured language, it listed several concerns that echoed Agnes's observations. The prioress read the words slowly, her voice tightening around the edges. The sisters listened with quiet astonishment. Some turned their eyes toward Agnes, others avoided her entirely. In the days that followed, subtle changes began. The herb bundles were spaced more widely. The granary was reinforced. Guidelines were written to help novices understand their tasks more clearly. No one acknowledged Agnes as the source of these improvements, but she saw the evidence each day as she moved through the priory. Yet, instead of easing the tension around her, these changes made it worse. Some sisters resented her influence. Others felt embarrassed for having dismissed her earlier warnings. The prioress, who valued unwavering order, now saw Agnes as someone whose presence provoked constant re-evaluation, which she interpreted as instability. The quiet walls of the priory were beginning to shift, and Sister Agnes stood at the center of this slow transformation. She had never intended to disrupt the house. She simply noticed what others overlooked, but in a world built on obedience, noticing too much could be a dangerous thing. And as she lay awake at night, listening to the distant call of an owl beyond the garden wall, she could not help wondering what consequences would unfold, now that the inspector's words had echoed her own. What would happen when the prioress could no longer ignore the patterns she had tried so hard to contain? And how far would the growing tension push Sister Agnes before the quiet life she had entered finally broke open completely? You might imagine that after the inspector's visit, the priory would settle into a new and gentler rhythm. For a short while it did. The sisters adjusted their habits with quiet reluctance, and the prioress moderated her strictness enough to avoid drawing further scrutiny from higher authorities. Days regained their muted familiarity, the steady hum of prayer, the soft scrape of sandals along stone floors, and the slow turning of seasons that guided their labor. But beneath this surface calm lingered a subtle strain. It sat not only in the hearts of the sisters, but also in the long echoing corridors of the priory itself, as though the building sensed the shift in its occupants. Sister Agnes lived through these days with a quiet that surprised many who watched her. She performed her duties with a steadiness that seemed almost new. She no longer argued over garden practices, or questioned the structure of the prayer hours. Some believed she had finally grown into the discipline expected of her. Others suspected her silence was not acceptance but weariness. Agnes herself did not speak of her thoughts, yet anyone who observed her closely could see a certain heaviness settle across her expression. Her reputation within the priory had changed. She was no longer viewed merely as a young woman who asked too many questions. Instead, she was recognized as someone whose observations had drawn the attention of outside authority. This shift made her dangerous in the eyes of those who valued stability above all else. While no one confronted her directly, she felt the subtle exclusion. Conversations quieted when she approached. Assignments were given without explanation. Younger novices, once eager to hear her thoughts, were now encouraged to keep their distance. The prioress attempted to restore a feeling of control by arranging the seasons more rigidly than before. She reorganized the work rotations, adjusted the prayer schedules, and increased the amount of silence expected in communal spaces. These changes affected everyone, but they weighed heavily on Agnes. She had always used small moments of conversation to understand the needs of the house. Now those moments were rare. Her words remained inside her, forming questions she had no place to voice. The turning point arrived during a late summer storm. Dark clouds gathered over the forest, and rain began to fall in sharp, steady lines. The roof of the main hall had weathered many seasons, but the prioress had postponed repairs to conserve resources. Agnes knew the damage was growing worse. She had noticed loose tiles weeks earlier, and mentioned them quietly to Sister Adelina, but the matter was set aside in favor of more immediate concerns. That evening, while the sisters gathered for prayers, a sudden leak dripped through the ceiling. At first it was only a faint tapping sound, then another drip joined it. Soon a thin flow of water formed a small puddle on the stone floor. The prioress paused mid-recitation, her voice tightening as she tried to maintain composure. The sound of the falling water echoed through the chapel like a persistent reminder of neglected duty. When the prayer ended, several sisters hurried to place a bucket beneath the leak. Agnes stood near the back of the room, watching the slow dripping as though it were marking the rhythm of an inevitable change. She spoke quietly, suggesting that the damage might be greater than the prioress realized. Her words, though soft, carried in the silence. The prioress stiffened. She dismissed the concern, insisting that repairs would be scheduled soon enough. But the expression on her face betrayed more pressure than she intended to show. The storm continued through the night, and by morning the damage had worsened. Several leaks appeared in the hall, and one small section of tile had begun to sag. The sisters moved quickly to protect their books and supplies. Despite their efforts, a few parchments became damp. This loss struck deeply, as each document had taken long hours to produce. The prioress, frustrated and tired, ordered the sisters to gather in the chapter house after breakfast. When they assembled, she delivered a stern reminder that maintaining the priory's dignity and order was the responsibility of every member. Although she never named Agnes directly, her glances made the intended target clear. She suggested that constant criticism weakened the unity necessary for difficult seasons. She urged the sisters to set aside unnecessary concerns and focus on obedience. Many nodded solemnly. A few avoided looking at Agnes altogether. Agnes listened without responding. She knew her observations had never been born of rebellion, but of attentiveness. Yet she also understood that her presence magnified the tension. Still, she could not prevent herself from noticing what others overlooked. It was part of her nature, as inherent as breath. A few days later, the prioress assigned Agnes to work alone in the orchard, pruning branches that had grown too heavy from summer growth. The task required focus and physical effort, and it kept her separated from the others. As she worked beneath the shade of the trees, she found her thoughts drifting to the quiet dissatisfaction that had grown inside her. She did not resent the prioress, nor did she wish to defy her. She simply wished to be heard without causing disruption. While she worked, Sister Edith approached the orchard gate. Her steps were slow, as though she debated turning back. Years earlier, she and Agnes had clashed over hidden food stores, and the memory still lingered between them. When she finally spoke, her voice held an uncertainty rarely heard from her. She admitted that she had once misjudged Agnes. She had seen her questions as threats rather than attempts to help. Edith confessed that after the inspector's visit, she had feared Agnes would gain undue authority, yet now she recognized that the priory had benefited from her vigilance. Her words were halting but sincere. Agnes listened quietly, appreciating the fragile honesty. It was the first time in months that someone had spoken to her without suspicion. The moment did not last long. While Edith spoke, Sister Adelina arrived unexpectedly. She observed the conversation with narrowed eyes before stepping forward. She reprimanded Agnes for neglecting her pruning work. The tone was unnecessary, and Edith's expression darkened, But Adelina pressed on, reminding Agnes that idle conversations were not permitted during labor. Agnes did not respond with anger. She simply nodded, but the exchange left an unsettled feeling in the air. Edith walked away silently, and Adelina lingered only long enough to ensure that Agnes returned to her task. The weeks that followed were marked by a growing division among the sisters. Some quietly appreciated the improvements brought about by Agnes's observations. Others feared that her manner of thinking could eventually challenge the authority that held their life together. These opposing feelings pulled at the priory like a slow and tightening rope. As autumn approached, a visiting cleric arrived to deliver a new set of guidelines from the larger religious house. The guidelines emphasized the importance of accurate record-keeping, clear communication between sisters, and proper handling of food storage and building maintenance. Many of these instructions matched the concerns that Agnes had raised over the years. Once again, the prioress was forced to implement changes that echoed her earlier warnings. These changes did not bring Agnes praise. Instead, they stirred discomfort. Some sisters felt embarrassed that their practices had required correction. Others feared that Agnes had influenced outsiders. Only a few understood that her insights came, not from ambition but from careful observation. The prioress, now facing growing pressure from above, made a decision that would mark the final chapter of Agnes's life in the priory. She summoned Agnes to her chamber one evening after prayers. The quiet room was lit by a single candle, its flame flickering gently against the stone wall. The prioress spoke calmly, but her words carried the weight of finality. She explained that although Agnes's observations had been accurate, her influence had caused unrest. She insisted that silence and unity were necessary for the health of the community, and that Agnes's questioning nature threatened that stability. She then announced her decision to send Agnes to a larger convent where her talents could be better managed. Agnes listened without interruption. The prioress's conclusion was not entirely unexpected. She had sensed the growing distance within the community. Still, the thought of leaving the priory stirred something heavy in her chest. She had grown into her life there, even if the walls had never fully embraced her. When she stepped out of the chamber, she paused in the hallway. The priory was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of evening lamps. She traced her fingers along the cool stone beside her, absorbing the stillness. She wondered whether the sisters would remember her as the one who asked too many questions, or as the one who tried to protect their fragile life. News of her departure spread quietly. A few sisters came to her privately in the following days, offering small words of thanks. Sister Edith placed a small bundle of lavender in her hands. A young novice whispered that she had learned courage from watching her. Even Sister Adelina, though she offered no praise, spoke gently to her for the first time, reminding Agnes to remain steady in her next home. On the morning of her departure, Agnes gathered her simple belongings. She stepped outside the priory gate and looked back at the stone walls that had both contained and shaped her. The air was cool, and the distant fields shimmered faintly beneath the rising light. As she walked down the narrow path toward the distant road, she wondered what life awaited her in the larger convent. Would her questions finally find a place where they were welcomed, or would she face the same tension between curiosity and obedience? Would the skills she had cultivated in quiet observation help her contribute to a new community, or would she once again be seen as a disruption? The priory faded behind her as she followed the path through the forest. With each step, she moved farther from the place that had defined her as troublesome and closer to the unknown life ahead. The quiet world around her hummed softly, rustling branches, distant bird calls, and the steady rhythm of her own breath. And as she walked, you might find yourself wondering what became of her after she left the small community that had struggled to understand her. Did her curiosity finally shape her into someone the world could accept, or did it continue to challenge every place she entered? Did she learn to soften her questioning nature, or did she remain forever drawn to the quiet details that others failed to notice? Perhaps the greater question lingers more deeply. What becomes of those whose minds see too much in worlds that prefer silence? And how many stories like hers have faded quietly into the forgotten corners of history, leaving behind only the faintest traces of a woman who simply wished to understand the world around her? The story of the lost pilgrim begins on an autumn morning, when the mists lay thick upon the northern road, muffling sound and softening the world into a watercolor haze. Travelers who made their way along this stretch of countryside often spoke of the silence that clung to the land, an unnatural stillness that seemed to deepen with every mile. It was a place that felt half forgotten, as though the living world did not stretch fully into these quiet reaches of the kingdom. Yet each year countless pilgrims passed through on their way to the distant shrine nestled among the northern hills, a holy site said to grant clarity to the troubled mind. One such pilgrim was a young man named Aldrich, a quiet soul from a lakeside village in the western reaches. He had set out alone, carrying little more than bread, water, and a worn letter from his mother that blessed his journey. He was neither reckless nor inexperienced. Like most in his village, he had grown up venturing into the woods and crossing long stretches of lonely field. He knew how to camp, how to listen for danger, how to track the shift of weather in the sway of branches, and yet what awaited him on the northern road was something no skill or experience could have prepared him for. In the early days of autumn, the road was lively with movement. Merchants hurried to deliver their last shipments before winter hindered travel. Farmers traveled with carts heavy with grain and salted fish. Priests offered blessings at crossroads, and travelers exchanged short stories before parting ways. Aldrich found comfort in this subtle companionship, the way a shared smile could ease the solitude of long days. But each step north carried him further from such small reassurances. After 3 days of steady walking, the land began to change. The abundance of people dwindled. The chatter of life softened. The inns that once stood bright and inviting became sparse, and by the 4th day they vanished entirely. This stretch of the northern road had long been avoided by all but the most determined pilgrims. The distance from settlement to settlement was long, and the forest grew close around the path as though nature sought to reclaim it. Aldrich felt the shift in atmosphere almost immediately. The forest seemed to breathe around him. Whenever he paused to drink or catch his breath, he noticed how his heartbeat echoed too loudly in his ears. The trees, tall and stoic, cast long shadows even at midday, and their branches interlocked overhead to form a canopy that let only a muted glow slip through. The air was cool, yet he found himself sweating with a strange unease that he could not explain. Despite this, Aldrich pressed onward. The map he carried described the route clearly enough. Continue north until the stone marker carved with the symbol of the shrine appeared. Turn east. Follow the rising path toward the hills. A simple journey, on parchment at least. By late afternoon the mist began to gather, curling low across the ground. It came slowly at first, then thickened until the edges of the world blurred. Aldrich paused, looking back along the road, hoping to catch sight of another traveller. He had seen no one since morning. The path behind him lay swallowed in white. Ahead, the road faded into a hazy glow that pulsed faintly as the light shifted. He considered making camp, though daylight still lingered. Something in the air urged caution. The forest had gone too quiet. In the past, when he traveled through woods, he heard birds, the movement of small animals, even the distant groan of tree trunks shifting in the breeze. Here there was nothing, not a single feathered creature or rustling leaf. The silence pressed against him with the weight of a living thing. Aldrich adjusted the straps of his pack and quickened his pace. If he continued for another hour, he might find a clearing, or at least a place where the air felt less suffocating. But the mist only deepened. Its tendrils clung to his clothes and chilled his skin. The road beneath him seemed to darken. The trees on either side receded into shadow, their forms dissolving into the fog. The only sound was the faint crunch of his footsteps. Eventually the road curved gently to the right, and for a moment Aldrich thought he saw a figure standing ahead, a faint shape, tall and slender, outlined in the thin light that filtered through the mist. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. He could not tell whether the figure faced him, or simply stood with its back turned. It did not move. He blinked once, twice, and the shape dissolved. It was as if it had never been there. The mist continued its slow drift, untouched and unbroken. Aldrich exhaled shakily and rubbed his eyes. Fatigue, he reasoned. A long day of travel and the strangeness of the forest were playing tricks on him. There was no reason to panic. Yet his heartbeat refused to calm. He continued walking, though each step felt heavier. The light dimmed further. What should have been the late afternoon glow of autumn sun now resembled twilight. He glanced up, hoping to see even a sliver of open sky, but the canopy was too dense. The world felt small, compressed, as if he had stepped into a pocket of time sealed off from the life he knew. After what felt like an eternity, Aldrich stumbled into a small clearing. The mist thinned, allowing him to see the outlines of the space. At its center stood an old wooden post, worn by time and covered in moss. Upon it was carved a faded symbol, a triangle with 3 small circles at its points. the mark of the shrine. Relief washed through him. He had reached the stone marker the map mentioned, though this one was wood, not stone. Yet he could not deny the symbol. It meant he was not lost. He was on the right path. He knelt beside the post and traced the grooves with shaking fingers. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, stirring the fog into swirling ribbons. In that moment, Aldrich felt something brush past him. Not a hand or a figure, but a presence, a shift in the air that prickled the back of his neck. He rose slowly, scanning the edges of the clearing. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, yet the sensation lingered. He turned east as the map instructed. A narrow path led between two ancient trees whose trunks twisted sharply as if frozen in mid-motion. The ground here was rougher, dotted with roots that rose like knuckles from the earth. Aldrich hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He had come too far to retreat now. As he walked, the world grew stranger still. The deeper he moved into the forest, the colder the air became. His breath emerged in faint white clouds. The mist followed him, curling close at his heels. Despite the chill, sweat dampened his palms. The sound came unexpectedly. A soft, distant hum, low and rhythmic, like a voice carried through layers of earth and stone. Aldrich stopped, head tilted, trying to locate the source. The hum wavered gently, then faded. A moment later it returned, closer this time, familiar yet impossible to place. With growing unease he pressed onward, though fear tugged at him. A stronger force urged him forward, a sense of destiny or inevitability, as though the forest itself guided his steps. Perhaps it was a foolish hope, or perhaps it was something far older, whispering from the depths of the land. The hum grew clearer, no longer a single tone but a chorus of layered sound, like many voices humming the same note, rising and falling in waves. It was not unpleasant. In fact, it felt soothing, almost warm. Aldrich's heartbeat slowed, his breathing steadied. The fear that had clung to him since the mist first gathered began to lift. He followed the sound until the trees opened into another clearing. Here the mist parted willingly, drifting to the edges as though held back by an unseen barrier. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, each one the height of a person, arranged in a perfect ring. Moss covered their surfaces, and small white flowers grew at their bases despite the cold. The melody came from within the circle. Aldrich approached slowly, each step measured. As he neared, the humming softened, then quieted completely. The sudden silence startled him. He stood at the edge of the stone ring, staring into the center. The ground inside was bare, untouched by moss or grass. It was as though the earth refused to let anything grow within that space. Aldrich stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the boundary, a wave of cold washed through him. His vision blurred. The world spun. He staggered, struggling to remain upright. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. The mist swirled violently around the outer edge of the ring. The stones seemed to lean inward, towering over him. He tried to step back but found he could not move. His feet felt rooted to the ground. The cold deepened. Darkness crept at the edges of his sight. He felt as though something was pulling at him, tugging at the very edges of his mind. A distant echo of the humming returned, low and mournful, wrapping around him like a shroud. Then everything went silent. Everything went still. And Aldrich, the young pilgrim of the northern road, vanished. Not a sound marked his disappearance. Not a trace of struggle remained. Only the circle of stones and the quiet, waiting mist. The forest swallowed the world once more. You return now to the quiet stone corridors of St. Rendar's house, where Brother Aldwin's daily ritual of counting small river pebbles has become both a curiosity and a quiet concern. By this point in the story, the whispers around him have grown louder, though never in his presence. This section deepens the world around him, revealing how a simple task shaped the rhythm of an entire religious house. You will move slowly through the dim spaces where men worked, prayed, and aged, all while one monk quietly built his own form of meaning from the most ordinary objects he could gather. Life in St. Rendar's house was not dramatic. Most days followed a predictable pattern that the older monks found comforting. The bell rang before dawn, calling the brothers to rise in the cold of early morning. Their breath lingered in pale clouds as they made their way to the small chapel. The soft drone of voices filled the air while the first hints of daylight crept through narrow windows. After prayer came a modest meal, then work, scripture, more work, evening prayer, and finally rest. It was a life built to steady the mind and quiet the heart. Brother Aldwin had lived within this pattern for many years. His steps were known, his silences were expected, and his habits felt harmless. But as he aged, his practice of counting pebbles shifted from something quaint to something he relied on for structure. Many monks took comfort in familiar tasks. Some mended rope, others polished wooden benches. One brother copied scripture for so many decades that his fingers curled inward from the repeated movement. Yet, Aldwin's task was different. His work had no practical value. It did not feed the house, repair anything, or produce something others could use. Still, he performed it with a devotion that rivaled the most disciplined scholars. Each morning after prayer, he visited the river that ran behind the orchard. The path to the river was narrow and slightly uneven. Moss grew on stones that had been walked on by generations. Aldwin moved slowly, not because he lacked strength, but because he noticed everything. He paused to study the frost on a slender branch. He watched as a bird pulled a worm from the mud. He listened to the wind shift through the bare trees. When he reached the water, he knelt and dipped his hands into the cold current. He sifted pebbles through his fingers, feeling their smooth surfaces. He selected only a few, always of similar size. He placed them gently into a small cloth pouch. Then he returned along the same path, stepping carefully, almost as if each footfall had a purpose beyond movement. By mid-morning, he sat at a wooden table in the quiet corner of the cloister. He poured the pebbles onto the surface and began counting. His voice was barely above a whisper. You might imagine him leaning forward, shoulders curved, eyes narrowed in deep focus. If anyone asked why he did this, he struggled to explain. He simply said that the numbers helped him understand the passing of time. The brothers around him were not sure what this meant. Brother Hadric, who oversaw the house accounts, worried that Aldwin's increased attachment to the pebbles hinted at mental weakness. He believed that monks must serve through practical labor, and that Aldwin's task had become a distraction. A quiet disagreement formed between Hadric and Brother Simon, who felt that every man found his own way to make peace with the demands of cloistered life. Simon argued that Aldwin did no harm, that his gentle nature was worth more than the small amount of labor he did not contribute. The prior, uncertain which view to support, watched Aldwin for several weeks. During this time, Aldwin's behavior became even more meticulous. He recorded his counts on scraps of parchment. The notes were sparse and repetitive, but he kept them in perfect order. He stored each parchment in a wooden box beside his narrow bed. He was not secretive, but he was careful. The box mattered to him, because the numbers mattered. He felt that each count revealed something steady in a world that changed slowly but relentlessly. Seasons marked the years at St. Rendar's house. Snow softened the edges of the cloister in winter. In spring, the herb garden filled with new shoots that promised summer medicines. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings that made the stone walls seem to tighten around the house. Through all these shifts, Aldwin counted pebbles. His persistence impressed some brothers and puzzled others. One late autumn afternoon, a storm swept across the region. Rain pounded the roofs, and winds bent the orchard trees dangerously. The brothers hurried to secure shutters and doors. As they moved between buildings, Hadric noticed Aldwin standing near the cloister walk, staring at a small stone that had rolled from his pouch. Rainwater flowed around it in narrow streams. Aldwin bent carefully, retrieved the stone, and held it against his chest as though it were something fragile. This sight troubled Hadric. After the storm settled, he brought his concerns to the prior. He spoke in a calm tone, but the concern beneath his words was clear. He believed Aldwin was withdrawing too deeply into his counting, that he was drifting away from the communal life they all depended on. The prior nodded slowly, promising to speak with Aldwin in private. The conversation took place the next evening. The prior found Aldwin sitting in his chamber, surrounded by small cloth pouches. The wooden box of parchment sat open beside him. Aldwin greeted the prior with warmth, unaware that anything was wrong. The prior asked gentle questions. How long had Aldwin been counting? What did he hope to learn? How much time did he spend with the pebbles each day? Aldwin answered honestly. He said that counting helped him remember that each moment had weight. He explained that numbers were steady even when thoughts wandered. He added that he feared losing track of time as the years passed, and the pebbles anchored him to something clear. The prior listened. He did not fully understand, but he recognized sincerity. Still, he reminded Aldwin that the life of a monk required balance. He suggested reducing the time spent with the pebbles and increasing time in communal tasks. Aldwin agreed readily. He did not want to cause worry. He promised to limit himself. For a short time, he kept this promise. He helped in the garden, carrying baskets of herbs even though his hands trembled slightly from age. He joined the brothers in repairing a broken section of the outer wall. He attended every prayer without drifting into thought. But as winter deepened, the quiet hours grew longer, and the cold seemed to push everyone into their own minds. Aldwin began counting again before dawn, long before the bell rang. He sat in the dim light of a small oil lamp, sorting and arranging his pebbles with steady care. The sound of stones tapping against the table filled his chamber in soft rhythms. He continued this practice more frequently as the days shortened. The other brothers noticed. Hadric frowned. Simon watched with sympathy. The prior hesitated, unsure whether intervention would help or harm. One morning, the brothers discovered Aldwin kneeling in the cloister walk, long before the sun rose. Snow dusted the ground. He had arranged small pebbles into a precise circle. The shape was perfect, almost impossibly so, given the cold and the early hour. When asked what he was doing, he said that he wanted to see if the pattern would help him understand why the winter felt heavier than usual. His voice carried no distress. It was simply matter of fact. This moment marked a turning point. The brothers realized that Aldwin's counting was no longer simply a habit. It had become the center of his inner world. They treated him gently, but they could not ignore the growing shift in his mind. Tasks that once seemed manageable now overwhelmed him. He forgot to eat, unless reminded. He fell asleep during scripture readings. He whispered numbers under his breath during communal meals. Simon tried to support him. He walked with Aldwin to the river, helping him gather pebbles safely. He encouraged him to rest between counting sessions. He invited him to talk about memories from his youth. Some days Aldwin responded well. Other days he slipped deeper into his quiet world of numbers. Through this growing tension, the brothers wondered what would happen if Aldwin lost the ability to structure his days even with his counting. They wondered how they might care for him if his mind wandered too far. They wondered how long he could continue living within the strict routine of St. Rundar's house. And as you picture Aldwin seated alone in the chilly cloister, small stones arranged in perfect patterns before him, you may find yourself wondering something as well. What would happen when his counting no longer gave him comfort? And what unexpected event would finally force the brothers to confront how deeply he had retreated into his quiet ritual? You return now to the quiet and aging halls of St. Rundar's house, at a time when winter lay across the land like a heavy blanket. Days were short, and the sky carried a pale grey that softened every shadow. The brothers moved more slowly in this season, conserving energy and warmth. Fires were tended with extra care, and water had to be broken free from thin layers of ice each morning. This was the setting in which Brother Aldwin's quiet struggle unfolded, drifting gradually toward a moment that would shape how the monks remembered him long after his voice faded. Aldwin had always been gentle, but during that particular winter he grew quieter than ever. His steps became softer, and his gaze more distant. The brothers noticed how he lingered near the river, even when the air was painfully cold. They watched him move pebbles between his hands as though they were fragile things. They saw the way he touched them lightly, almost reverently, as if each stone held a memory he wished to preserve. The prior grew uneasy. He had hoped that gentle guidance would help Aldwin regain balance, but the opposite seemed to be happening. Aldwin's attachment to the stones deepened until it shaped nearly every moment of his day. The prior held several quiet conversations with Brother Simon, whose sympathy for Aldwin never weakened. Simon believed that Aldwin's mind was drifting not from refusal but from age itself. He saw no malice and no disobedience. What he saw was a man holding on to a ritual because he feared losing his steady sense of time and place. Hadric remained firm in his concern. He believed that indulgence encouraged Aldwin's decline. He argued that more structure would help, that the older monk needed defined responsibilities to anchor him. The prior listened to both men, torn between two interpretations of proper care. The brothers had weathered disputes before, but this one weighed more heavily because it involved someone beloved in his own quiet way. One morning, before the sun had risen, Aldwin did not appear at prayer. At first, no one worried. Old age often brought slower mornings, yet as the minutes passed and the chanting concluded, Brother Simon felt a slight tug of unease. He excused himself and walked toward Aldwin's chamber. The door stood slightly open, letting a thin ribbon of cold air drift into the hallway. Inside, the bed was neatly arranged, untouched. The wooden box where Aldwin kept his parchment notes was open, but the pouches of pebbles were gone. Simon hurried to the cloister walk. Snow had fallen through the night, leaving a pale, unbroken surface across the stone floor, except it was not unbroken. A line of footprints led toward the orchard gate. They belonged to Aldwin. He followed the trail quickly, calling Aldwin's name in a soft voice that would not wake the entire house. When he reached the edge of the orchard, he saw Aldwin standing near the fence. The older monk was looking at the horizon, holding one small pebble between his fingers. His shoulders rose and fell with slow breaths. Simon approached carefully and spoke to him, relieved to see that he was unharmed. Aldwin smiled faintly. He said the sunrise would feel different that morning, and he wanted to be outside before it arrived. His voice carried the tone of someone who had been awake for many hours. Simon led him gently back inside, guiding him toward warmth. The brothers accepted Aldwin's early wanderings as an eccentric habit, but privately, they knew it signaled a deeper shift. As weeks passed, Aldwin's world narrowed even further. He often forgot conversations within moments. He sometimes misplaced his sandals or his robe. Once he left the dining hall without eating anything at all, and did not seem to notice. Yet he never forgot his pebbles. He knew exactly how many he should carry each morning. He knew which ones belonged to each season. If one went missing, he searched for it with patient intensity. His numbers and the soft click of stones against the wooden table were constants when everything else began to drift. Near the end of winter came the moment that the monks would remember for many seasons. It began on a morning so cold that the river stones cracked along their surfaces. Frost clung to the herb garden, and the air stung the skin. Most brothers stayed close to the fires, tending what chores could be done indoors. Aldwin, however, did not join them in the chapel for prayer. This time the absence was unmistakably worrisome. Simon and two younger brothers searched the cloister, then the storerooms, then the orchard. When they reached the river path, they saw faint indentations in the snow. Aldwin had walked there recently. They followed the steps carefully, keeping their voices low, as though loud sounds might shatter the stillness. When they reached the riverbank, they found Aldwin kneeling beside the water. The river had frozen at its edges, but the central current still moved in slow, steady waves. Aldwin had arranged a ring of pebbles around him, each one forming part of a perfect circle. He was whispering numbers. His voice was calm and rhythmic. Simon approached him gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Aldwin looked up with clear eyes, and said something that Simon never forgot. He said that the numbers suddenly made sense. He said he finally understood how many days he had lived, how many moments he had counted, and how many he had let slip away. He said he was no longer afraid of forgetting, because the numbers had remembered for him. Simon did not fully understand these words, but he felt the weight of them. There was no fear in Aldwin's face, only relief. Simon helped him stand. The younger brothers gathered the pebbles and placed them in the pouch. Aldwin allowed himself to be led back toward the house, leaning lightly on Simon for support. After this moment, Aldwin changed. His counting slowed. He no longer arranged the stones in elaborate patterns. His parchment notes remained untouched. He still carried the pouch, but he rarely opened it. Instead, he spent more time listening to the other brothers, sitting beside them as they worked. He asked simple questions about daily tasks, and watched them with quiet contentment. For the first time in many months, he seemed present rather than drifting. The brothers found this shift comforting, though they sensed that Aldwin was nearing the end of his long journey through monastic life. They treated him with gentle respect, assisting him with small tasks, walking with him to prayer, and making sure he rested when he grew tired. In early spring, Aldwin passed away in his chamber during the quiet hours before dawn. Simon discovered him seated upright, the pouch of pebbles resting on his lap. His face was peaceful, and his hands were folded. The brothers held a simple burial, laying him to rest in the small cemetery behind the orchard. They placed the pouch of stones beside him, because they believed it belonged with him as much as his robe or sandals. In the weeks that followed, the monks spoke often of Aldwin's unusual devotion to counting. Some viewed it as a sign of a mind seeking order as age loosened its ties. Others believed it was his way of contemplating the steady nature of time. All agreed that his counting had been harmless, and even comforting in its own way. The prior later wrote that Aldwin had found a type of wisdom that could not be measured in productivity or usefulness, but instead in gentle persistence. Brother Simon kept one pebble from Aldwin's pouch. He placed it on a small shelf near the chapel door. It sat there quietly, collecting dust, unnoticed by most. Yet whenever Simon passed it, he touched it lightly, with 2 fingers, and remembered how something so small had anchored an entire life. As the years passed, the story of the pebble-counting monk became one of the quiet tales told to novices who arrived uncertain of their place. It reminded them that each man found his own rhythm within the steady routines of monastic life, some through work, some through prayer, and some through the soft and steady weight of a pebble held in the palm of a hand. And you may find yourself wondering what it means when a person holds tightly to a simple ritual, and whether the smallest tasks sometimes reveal the deepest truths about how humans cope with time, memory, and the slow passage of their own days. You will now step into the quiet world of medieval bookmaking, a place where time moved at the pace of ink drying on parchment. Long before printing presses and quick copies, every word that entered a book was written by hand. The houses that produced these books depended on scribes whose days revolved around the steady movement of quill across skin. Among these patient workers lived a man whose slowness became both his burden and his strange legacy. His name was Brother Tolan, a scribe of modest skill and extreme deliberation. Where other scribes filled pages each day, Tolan sometimes completed only a handful of lines. His pace puzzled visiting scholars and challenged the patience of his superiors. Yet, despite criticism and concern, he maintained the same steady rhythm year after year. He never hurried, he never wavered, and he never explained the full reason for his pace. Tolan lived at Brevenford House, an old community tucked between rolling hills and scattered farms. The house was small and quiet, known for its peaceful hermitage rather than its intellectual achievements. Its scriptorium was modest, a long narrow chamber with wooden desks arranged beneath a row of narrow windows. Light gathered in faint beams during the late morning, illuminating dust motes that drifted like slow-moving stars. This was the room where Tolan spent most of his adult life. The day at Brevenford House began with morning prayer. The brothers rose in the cool darkness, moved through the stone halls in a quiet procession, and then dispersed to their duties. Some tended the gardens, others shoveled grain or chopped vegetables for the kitchen. A few cared for the animals. Tolan walked each morning toward the scriptorium, carrying his small bundle of tools wrapped in linen. His walk was unhurried, his posture slightly bent from years of leaning over parchment. When he entered the scriptorium, he always paused for a moment. He let the quiet fill him before he settled at his desk. This desk, worn smooth from countless hours of use, was his anchor. On it lay a small horn of ink, a quill trimmed to a precise point, and a blade used for scraping mistakes from parchment. Tolan arranged these in exactly the same order each morning. First the quill, then the blade, then the ink, positioned so that his hand could reach each tool without a glance. Before writing, Tolan always smoothed the parchment with the edge of his hand. He checked for tiny imperfections, raised fibers, or uneven cuts that might catch the quill. Other scribes performed this task quickly. Tolan took his time. He often ran his hand over the same spot several times before he felt satisfied. Only then did he begin to copy the manuscript placed before him. His movements were deliberate in the extreme. Each letter unfolded slowly, almost cautiously, as if he believed the wrong stroke could fracture the quiet around him. His quill barely whispered across the parchment. When he finished a word, he lifted the quill, waited for a breath, then moved to the next one. He paused between sentences, letting his eyes rest on the ink as though the words needed time to settle into the page. The scriptorium's overseer, Brother Merrick, tried to hide his concern. Tolan had joined Brevenford House many years earlier, at a time when the community needed scribes desperately. Merrick had expected him to develop speed with practice, but instead the opposite happened. Tolan grew slower with age, not faster. His writing remained clear and beautifully formed, but the pages beside him filled at a rate that troubled the overseer. While other scribes produced several leaves each week, Tolan sometimes completed only a few paragraphs. Yet Merrick could not deny that Tolan's pages were exquisite. His letters stood perfectly balanced. His spacing never wavered. Lines remained straight even without a guide. The illuminator, Brother Senek, often remarked that Tolan's pages required almost no correction or adjustment. It was as though the slowness gave him an accuracy no other scribe could match. Still, Brevenford House depended on its manuscripts for trade and reputation. Slow work meant fewer completed texts. This quiet reality lingered in the minds of those who worked alongside Tolan each day. They respected his dedication, but they also wondered why he moved at such an unchanging pace. Some believed he feared making mistakes. Others thought he carried an inner stillness that produced his steady rhythm. A few whispered that his slowness was not a matter of habit, but a discipline formed long ago, tied to something he refused to speak about. Tolan himself never offered clarification. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were simple and kind. Outside the scriptorium, Tolan worked in the garden. He tended herbs used for healing and inks. His gentle touch suited the delicate plants. He often watered them with more care than was necessary. The brothers noticed that he removed each weed with a precision matching his writing style. He moved slowly through the rows, studying each leaf as though trying to understand the world by examining its smallest parts. Meals at Brevenford House were quiet affairs. The brothers ate in silence, except for the soft scrape of wooden bowls. Tolan always sat at the end of the table, chewing slowly, savoring each bite. This was not absent-minded slowness. It had intention. Everything he did seemed wrapped in the same unhurried attention. When evening came, the brothers gathered once more in the chapel. Tolan's voice blended with theirs, steady and calm. He never missed a prayer, never arrived late, and never appeared distracted. After prayer, he often lingered in the scriptorium for a few final minutes, tidying his tools and closing the shutters. Then he returned to his chamber, where he slept lightly, and woke often, as though his mind resisted the rushing current of dreams. The brothers accepted Tolan's slowness, even if they did not fully understand it. But one day, as a new commission arrived from a nearby house, the question of his pace could no longer be ignored. The commission requested that Brevenford House produce a large manuscript, a volume of considerable importance. The house needed the income, the scriptorium needed the recognition. The overseer assigned sections of the text to each scribe, but when he reached Tolan, he paused. Assigning the same amount of work to him as to the others would delay the project. Assigning less would suggest that his contribution held less value. Neither choice felt fair. Merrick consulted the prior, who listened quietly. The prior was a thoughtful man, keenly aware of the fragile balance between kindness and responsibility. He had watched Tolan for many years and believed there was more to his slowness than simple caution. He wondered whether Tolan carried a memory or an event from his past that shaped his measured pace. But without Tolan's willingness to speak, the prior could only guess. In the end, Merrick assigned Tolan a smaller portion of the manuscript. He delivered the news gently, expecting disappointment. But Tolan simply nodded, thanked him, and returned to his desk. He showed no frustration, only his usual calm acceptance. The other scribes whispered among themselves. Some felt relieved, believing the decision would speed the project. Others felt uneasy, sensing that something had shifted. Tolan continued his work with his familiar precision, unaware of the quiet ripples spreading around him. As days turned into weeks, even the young novices began to wonder why Brother Tolan wrote as though each letter carried the weight of the entire page. They asked him politely one afternoon, gathering around his desk while he prepared a fresh sheet of parchment. Tolan listened carefully to their question, his expression thoughtful, yet he gave no real answer. He simply said that he wished to give each word the time it deserved. It was the same explanation he had offered for years, and although it sounded reasonable, it left the novices unsatisfied. They sensed a deeper meaning behind his simple answer, something shaped by a memory that Tolan guarded closely. What none of them knew was that the parchment he wrote on reminded him of a moment long before he entered Brevenford House, a moment he had never described, a moment that changed how he viewed ink, words, and the fragile nature of written memory. He carried that moment with him every time he lifted his quill. He carried it when he paused between sentences. He carried it in his silence and in the steady rhythm of his breath. And you may now find yourself wondering what event in Tolan's past shaped such careful discipline, and why he chose to express it through slowness rather than speed. You might imagine the life of a medieval monastic scribe as a peaceful one, filled with contemplative silence and gentle hours of copying sacred words. Yet as you move deeper into the daily world of Brother Aldrich, you find something different, something slower and heavier. The quiet was real, but the peace was deceptive, and in its place there stood a constant pressure that shaped every movement of his day. When you return to his desk in your mind, you see him where you left him in the first section, bent over the manuscript that consumed his hours. His quill hovers above parchment that he himself had helped prepare from stretched and scraped hide. The ink bowl beside him is still, but his shoulders rise and fall with the steady rhythm of a man settling into work that he knows will continue long after the sun fades. This was the world of the medieval scribe, where time moved at a pace determined not by the hours, but by the pages he had yet to finish. Every morning began in the same manner. The bell in the courtyard sounded, its tones carrying through the cloistered walkways like a slow ripple through cool water. You would walk with the monks down the corridors, their footsteps soft on the stone. They spoke little, because speech was rationed in many monasteries as carefully as ink. Silence preserved focus, and focus preserved the sacred work. Brother Aldrich felt that silence deeply. It was a companion and a burden at the same time. After morning prayers, the scribes moved to the scriptorium. You might picture it as a warm space, but it was usually quite cold. The windows were narrow by design, to protect the room from wind and too much sunlight. Excessive light could damage manuscripts. Excessive darkness made writing nearly impossible. As the autumn months came, the scribes often struggled to see their own writing, unless a candle was allowed. Candles were expensive, so they were provided sparingly. Brother Aldrich often warmed his hands over his breath before he even touched the quill. On some mornings, the cold caused the ink to thicken, so he had to stir it with the tip of a small wooden stick. The ink was made from ground oak galls, iron salts and gum, mixed slowly until the liquid became dark enough to endure the centuries. If you look at medieval manuscripts today, many of them still carry that same ink, even though it has eaten slightly into the parchment. The scribes knew this would happen, but they valued durability more than beauty. They wanted the written words to last, even if the pages became scarred in time. Brother Aldrich's back ached steadily through those long sessions. Scribes often sat on hard benches, leaning forward for hours. They did not understand spinal alignment in the way you do now. They knew only that the work had to be completed. Some monasteries allowed the scribes to stand while writing, to lessen the strain. Aldrich preferred sitting, even though it caused him discomfort. The routine steadied him. It kept his thoughts from wandering too far into the restlessness that had been growing inside him. The rhythm of writing had become something like a heartbeat. Dip the quill, press the nib to parchment, form the letters, breathe slowly, continue the line. It was a quiet pattern, almost meditative. Yet for Aldrich it was also troubling. As he copied the words of theologians and chroniclers, he sometimes felt an urge to write what he himself had seen, or what he thought, or what he feared. But scribes were not encouraged to create content. Their purpose was preservation, not expression. Their own voices were not meant to appear on the page. This tension grew throughout the season. He felt it most strongly at midday when the scribes were allowed a short rest. They placed weights on the corners of their parchment to keep it from curling while they stepped away. They covered ink bowls to keep dust from settling on the surface. Some monks stretched their hands, stiff from gripping quills for too long. A few walked the courtyard in small, slow circles, breathing in the cold air. Aldrich usually remained inside. He would study the pages he had completed, checking for mistakes. Mistakes mattered in ways that feel alien to you now. Each page required so much time and material that a single error could become a significant problem. Some mistakes could be scraped away with a sharp knife and corrected, but others stained the parchment too deeply, or disrupted the spacing, or created a gap that could not be concealed. The abbot did not punish errors harshly, yet the shame of making one weighed heavily. Scribes often feared disappointing not just their abbot, but the scholars who would use the manuscripts in future years. After their break, they returned to the scriptorium. The afternoon hours felt longer, because the mind tired faster than the hands. Aldrich sometimes found the words drifting before his eyes, the letters losing their shape as fatigue pulled him downward. That was when he noticed the whispers outside the scriptorium door, not spoken whispers, but the sound of wind slipping through the courtyard stones. The winter weather carried currents that moved through the monastery like wandering thoughts. He found himself listening to them whenever his mind drifted. He would close his eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle around him. Then he returned to his work. Dip the quill, press the nib, form the letters, breathe slowly. The pattern continued. The evenings brought a different kind of quiet. After supper the monks spent time in private devotion or reading. Some monasteries allowed scribes to work into the later hours, but Aldrich's order limited evening writing unless a project was urgent. Instead, he spent the time examining manuscripts created by scribes who had worked there many generations earlier. Their handwriting varied greatly. Some were careful with perfect spacing, others were cramped, as though the scribe had been racing against time. Aldrich studied these pages closely, wondering about the men who produced them. What had their days been like? What had they felt? During those quiet evenings, he discovered that some of the older manuscripts contained marginal notes. These tiny messages, written by exhausted scribes, revealed things almost never spoken. One wrote that his eyes hurt, another complained of cold fingers, another begged the reader to remember him in prayer. These small confessions fascinated Aldrich. They were like echoes of people who had spent their lives doing work that most would never acknowledge. It was then that his restlessness began to sharpen. He realized that scribes in earlier generations sometimes went beyond their assigned tasks and wrote fragments of their own thoughts. They slipped them between the lines. They carved them into borders. They hid them in the curves of decorated letters. They did not seek recognition. They simply needed a place to express themselves. Aldrich felt the same need rising within him. You may imagine him one evening, seated alone with a candle flickering beside him. He held an unfinished page of his current manuscript. His thumb traced the margin, and he wondered whether the abbot would ever notice an extra phrase, a small addition that offered a thought of his own. It was not rebellion. It was longing, a longing to leave a mark that was not only a copy of someone else's voice. This desire did not leave him. It stayed with him through the next morning. It remained when he dipped his quill. It lingered when he returned to correcting the previous day's work, and by the afternoon he felt it clearly, a quiet yearning to write something beyond the strict rows of text in front of him. The question that pressed most heavily on him was simple. If he added even a tiny note, would it truly harm the work? Would it change the world beyond his small desk, or would it simply let him breathe a little easier? But he did not act on this feeling. Not yet. Instead, he continued his steady work, even as the thoughts gathered with more weight. And it was this growing pressure, the slow and subtle shift in his own sense of purpose, that would soon lead him toward a moment that would alter the direction of his life as a scribe. As you picture him finishing that long day, placing his quill in its small wooden holder, and stepping quietly from the cold scriptorium, you might wonder what he would eventually choose. Would he remain silent, like so many scribes before him, or would he dare to let his own voice appear in the margins of history? And as night settles over the monastery, one question lingers softly in the silence. What happens when a man trained only to copy begins to feel the need to write his own truth? When you return to Brother Aldrich's world for the final time, the monastery feels heavier than before. Perhaps it is the gathering winter, or perhaps it is the knowledge that you have followed him long enough to sense that something within him has begun to shift. His days have not changed in any practical way. He still wakes before dawn to the sound of the slow bell, still walks the same stone path to the chapel, still sits at the same desk in the same cold scriptorium, but his mind, the quiet space behind his steady hands, no longer moves in the same rhythm. Each morning, as he settled into the familiar sequence of dipping the quill and forming letters, he began to notice thoughts that never visited him in earlier seasons. He started seeing the blank spaces on the parchment, not simply as boundaries but as opportunities. He wondered about the men whose manuscripts he had copied, the scribes who had added small confessions in the margins, men he would never meet yet somehow understood. Their hidden phrases felt like lanterns left in dark corridors. They created the sense of a life within the work, a small pulse of personality in a world where individuality was not openly encouraged. The monastery expected uniformity, uniform devotion, uniform obedience, uniform handwriting. A scribe was not supposed to leave pieces of himself on the parchment. The work was meant to be sacred, and the scribe himself was supposed to disappear behind it. But Aldrich was finding that he could no longer disappear entirely. Day after day, the urge to add something of his own grew stronger. It was not pride that drove him. It was not rebellion. It was simply a need to speak in a place where speaking aloud was rare. The turning point came during one especially long afternoon. The sunlight had dimmed earlier than usual, muted behind thick winter clouds. The candles provided only a thin and flickering light. The ink was slightly thicker because of the cold, and Aldrich had to stir it often to keep it from clumping. The manuscript he worked on was a collection of homilies that had already consumed many weeks of his life. Each page took shape slowly, and he had grown familiar with the voice of the author he was copying, though he no longer remembered the author's name. The words were measured, careful, methodical. Aldrich admired them, but he did not feel moved by them. It was on the lower margin of a nearly finished page that he found his hand pausing. The quill hung above the parchment. His breath fogged faintly in the cold air. He looked at the empty space beneath the final line, and felt an ache in his chest, small and quiet but undeniable. He thought of the anonymous scribe centuries earlier, who had written that his eyes hurt from the endless work. Another had written that he was cold, that the wind entered the scriptorium through cracks in the wall. Another asked the reader to pray for the one who had carried the burden of copying the page. These were not grand statements. They were small truths. And in those moments, Brother Aldrich felt that he too carried a truth he had never expressed. His fingers trembled slightly as he lowered the quill. He hesitated. Not because he feared punishment, but because he knew that once the ink touched the parchment, he would be stepping across a boundary that scribes were not meant to cross. A scribe was supposed to leave no trace of his own personality, yet here he was, ready to leave a fragment of his soul in the margin. He wrote only a short line, a brief thought, quiet and unadorned. He wrote that he hoped the reader, whoever they might be, would remember that the words had passed through the hands of someone who had tried his best every day, even when tired. It was not a confession. It was not a complaint. It was simply a whisper of existence. When he finished the line, he stared at it for a long time. The letters looked smaller than usual, as though he was afraid of being noticed, and perhaps he was, but he also felt a steady warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The words felt right. They felt necessary. They felt true. That evening, as the scribes closed the scriptorium, Aldrich felt both lightness and unease. He walked slowly through the dim corridors, the stone beneath his feet echoing with his every step. The monastery had a way of amplifying silence. He wondered whether anyone would ever see what he had written. Manuscripts often disappeared into storage, or were sent to other houses. A scribe rarely saw the finished work once it left the scriptorium. There was a strange comfort in that uncertainty. His small note might survive centuries, or it might be lost within a few years. He had no control over its fate. During supper, he barely tasted the bread and soup. His mind replayed the moment when he set the quill to the page. He expected to feel guilt, but he did not. Instead, he felt something like calm, a quiet recognition that even within a life defined by repetition, there was room for a human breath, a small pulse of individuality. The next morning, however, the calm faded slightly. The abbot announced that he would review the nearly completed manuscripts later that week. This was a routine practice, but for Aldrich, it felt suddenly urgent. Would the abbot notice the extra line? And if he did, what might he say? The abbot was not a harsh man, but he valued order. He valued rules. He valued the traditions that had shaped the monastery for many generations. Aldrich tried to convince himself that the abbot would not examine the margins closely. He reminded himself that, even if the note was discovered, it was not disrespectful, it was simply honest. But even honesty can feel dangerous when rules are held in careful balance. The days passed slowly as he waited for the review. He continued to work with quiet focus, though his mind drifted often. He imagined the abbot flipping through the pages. He imagined him pausing at the margin. He imagined a raised eyebrow, or perhaps nothing at all. When the morning of the review arrived, the scribes placed their manuscripts on the long wooden table in the center of the scriptorium. The abbot walked slowly down the line, turning pages with steady hands. The scribes stood nearby in a respectful and silent row. The only sound was the soft turning of parchment. When the abbot reached Aldrich's manuscript, Aldrich felt his breath tighten. He stood perfectly still, his hands folded behind his back. The abbot examined the handwriting, occasionally murmuring in approval. He traced the decorated initials, nodded at the ornamentation, and checked for errors. Then he reached the page with the small note in the margin. He paused. Aldrich felt time stretch like a string pulled too tight. The abbot leaned closer. His eyes rested on the line. He read it once, then again. The room seemed colder, the silence thicker. At last the abbot looked up at Aldrich. There was no anger in his expression, only curiosity. He asked Aldrich whether he had written the line. Aldrich admitted that he had. The abbot studied him for a moment longer, then looked back at the page. Instead of reprimanding him, the abbot simply said that scribes should not forget that they too were part of the work. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. He reminded the assembled scribes that though their task was to preserve the words of others, they were living souls with their own burdens and thoughts. It was not common for abbots to encourage personal expression, yet he did not erase the line. He simply closed the manuscript and moved to the next one. The tension drained from Aldrich's shoulders as he watched the abbot continue down the row. He realized then that what he had feared most had not come to pass. His small expression had not caused disorder. It had not been condemned. It had simply been seen, acknowledged, and allowed to remain. That evening, when Aldrich returned to the scriptorium alone to clean his tools, he looked at the manuscript resting on the table. He touched the margin lightly, tracing the space where his note sat hidden between lines of someone else's thoughts. It struck him that this was perhaps all a scribe could ask for, a chance not to change the world, but to leave a faint and honest imprint upon it, a reminder that someone had lived behind the letters. You might picture him later, sitting in the darkness with only a soft candle flame to keep him company. He was not thinking of glory or memory. He was thinking of the simple truth that every life, no matter how quiet, contains a desire to be known even in the smallest way. His note would never make him famous. It would never travel through the world with scholars who might speak his name, but it would remain on that page, a small breath of humanity pressed into parchment meant to last beyond his lifetime. And so the story of Brother Aldrich closes not with triumph, but with a gentle understanding. Sometimes the smallest choices carry the greatest meaning. Sometimes a life devoted to copying can still contain a moment of creation. And sometimes history is not shaped by grand actions, but by a quiet hand choosing to speak in a margin where no voice was expected. As you imagine the scriptorium settling into its nightly silence, one final thought lingers softly. How many other hidden notes written by hands long forgotten still rest quietly in the margins of manuscripts waiting to be read? You now move to a very different part of medieval life, one that was cloistered and governed by strict routines but not immune to human weakness or scandal. In the small abbey of St. Clarice, tucked in a damp valley between rolling hills and misty forests, there lived a nun whose behavior became infamous, not for acts of heroism, nor for profound spiritual insight, but for misdeeds that would disturb her sisters and perplex historians for centuries. Her name was Sister Marette, though records also refer to her as Marguerite in scattered documents, leaving you already with the sense of ambiguity that surrounds her life. St. Clarice's Abbey was typical for the era. Stone walls rose in simple elegance around a central courtyard. A well-fed garden provided herbs for medicinal use. Long corridors led to cells where nuns slept, prayed, and studied their texts. Silence was expected almost all the time. The rhythm of the abbey was governed by bells, calling sisters to the chapel, the refectory, and back to private devotions. Everything was meant to instill discipline, reflection, and obedience. Yet within this order, the ordinary human flaws of Sister Marette emerged, quietly but persistently. She was not outwardly conspicuous at first. Her veil was always straight, her hands washed and neat, and her recitation of the canonical hours precise. But behind this appearance of propriety, she began to bend the rules. Small acts at first, taking more than her allotted portion of bread at meals, lingering in the kitchen past her assigned chores, or hiding scraps of food for later. These might seem trivial, yet in an abbey where discipline was maintained through precision, they were noticed and recorded in careful chronicles. What made Sister Marette notorious was not these minor infractions alone, but a growing pattern of deception and manipulation. She was clever, able to present a face of innocence when questioned, yet her actions often contradicted the expectations of her superiors. She would exchange notes with nuns in distant cells using scraps of parchment, pass them under doors, or conceal them in folds of her habit. The content of these messages varied. Sometimes they were gossip, sometimes instructions for minor mischief, and sometimes it seemed simple attempts to influence the daily routines of her sisters to her advantage. The abbess of St. Clarice, Mother Beatrice, was a strict but fair leader. She prided herself on maintaining order through vigilance rather than harsh punishment. Even so, Sister Marette's cleverness challenged her authority. Instances of stolen food, mischief in the laundry, and interference in tasks began to accumulate. Nuns whispered about her in the corridors, calling her mischievous, troublesome, even dangerous to the peace of the abbey. Still, no one could catch her fully in the act, as though she had an uncanny sense of timing and opportunity. Her misdeeds were always small enough to evade major reprimand, yet frequent enough to create an undercurrent of unrest. One particularly cold winter, when the abbey's stores were low and frost had cracked the garden beds, Marette's actions took a more serious turn. The chronicle records that she deliberately redirected water from the main cistern to fill a small hidden barrel she kept in her cell. This act endangered the abbey's supply for cooking and cleaning, though at first no one noticed. When the shortage became apparent, suspicion fell upon the usual suspects, novices unfamiliar with the pipes, or the nuns responsible for cleaning. But Marette had already covered her tracks. Only much later did the truth begin to surface, pieced together from inconsistent accounts and subtle clues noted in the abbey's daily records. Moret's cunning was matched by a charm that often disarmed those around her. Visitors to the abbey sometimes remarked on her polite speech and gentle manners. She could smile in a way that suggested penitence even when she was responsible for some minor disruption. This duality, the ability to appear obedient while acting contrary to rules, made her a particularly fascinating figure for later historians. She was not violent, nor cruel in the physical sense. Yet her manipulations eroded trust, creating tension among the sisters and undermining the careful order that the abbess had spent years cultivating. Despite these behaviors, Moret also engaged in tasks that could be interpreted as devotion. She helped in the infirmary, assisted with copying manuscripts, and sometimes tended the garden with surprising diligence. These actions made it difficult to condemn her entirely. She was, in a sense, both a model nun and a nuisance simultaneously. The tension between her good deeds and her misdeeds created a narrative that chroniclers of the time found compelling, though frustratingly incomplete. The paradox of Sister Moret's life lies in this duality. How could one woman uphold the spiritual mission of the abbey, and yet consistently subvert the rules in ways both subtle and bold? Was it ambition, mischief, or a deeper dissatisfaction with the cloistered life? The records do not answer these questions definitively, leaving you with a sense of unease and curiosity. Her story forces you to consider the complexities of human behavior in environments designed to suppress self-interest and promote collective discipline. You may imagine her moving through the abbey corridors during the long evenings, candlelight flickering against her habit. She pauses at doors, whispers to a fellow sister, adjusts a bucket, or removes a small herb for later use. To the casual observer, she is simply dutiful. To those who know the subtle disruptions she orchestrates, she is far more significant. Each small act accumulates, creating ripples that affect daily life in ways that may never be fully understood. By the end of this first section, the abbey itself becomes a character in her story. Its stone walls, narrow corridors, gardens, and kitchen workspaces, all stages for a drama of quiet rebellion and careful observation. You, the listener, are left with a question that will guide the rest of her tale. How did one nun, living a life ostensibly devoted to obedience and prayer, manage to influence and unsettle an entire abbey without ever drawing the full wrath of authority? And what, if anything, might be revealed when her cleverness ultimately meets consequences she could not foresee? As the seasons passed at St. Clarissa's Abbey, Sister Moret's subtle disruptions grew more intricate. You might imagine a life of cloistered routine as predictable, even monotonous, yet Moret found ways to bend every rule without breaking the overt structure of her world. The abbey remained a place of prayer, work, and reflection, but the tension between discipline and deception threaded through its corridors like a faint but persistent current. Winter had passed, leaving behind early spring with its damp chill and budding herbs. The sisters began tending the garden more actively, preparing for planting. Each day was regimented: prayers at dawn, meals, chores, study, and work in the scriptorium. It was in these ordinary rhythms that Moret quietly asserted influence. She would arrive early at the herb garden, repositioning seedlings in ways that went unnoticed at first, but subtly disrupted the orderly rotation of crops. She misfiled medicinal herbs, not out of malice, but seemingly to assert a small measure of control over the abbey's resources. Food remained a central element of her subtle power. Portions of bread and cheese were measured with care for every sister, yet Moret managed to divert a small portion into her cell or to share selectively with a novice she favored. These acts of minor theft were rarely detected, but their effect on the abbey's stores became apparent in subtle ways. Other sisters might find their meals slightly smaller, their assigned portion of butter or grain missing a fraction. To you, the listener, this may seem trivial, yet in a closed and carefully rationed community, even the smallest disruption could shift trust and create anxiety. Moret's cleverness extended to the scriptorium as well. She learned which manuscripts the abbess valued most, and would accidentally misplace pages, delaying work in a way that appeared unintentional. At times she added marginal notes of her own devising, insightful or humorous, though unauthorized, without causing lasting damage to the texts. Visitors who glimpsed these notes occasionally praised the clarity and wit of the writing, unaware of their subversive origin. Moret, in her quiet way, learned to manipulate admiration and authority simultaneously. Yet cleverness alone could not guarantee safety. The abbess, Mother Beatrice, began noticing patterns. Reports from novices and other sisters hinted at small irregularities: herbs missing from the storeroom, subtle rearrangements in the garden, misplaced parchments in the scriptorium. She observed Moret with increased scrutiny, noting her punctuality and diligence, but also the quiet way she managed to slip away during work periods or linger longer than others in certain areas. One day, during an inspection of the abbey's stores, the abbess confronted Moret indirectly. She asked the sisters about missing herbs and slightly diminished food portions. Responses were inconsistent. Some novices hesitated, reluctant to accuse anyone. Older nuns offered vague conjecture. Beatrice's eyes eventually rested on Moretti, who smiled faintly and claimed ignorance, her tone respectful and calm. At that moment the abbess realized that this was no ordinary novice mistake. This was deliberate, yet executed with such subtlety that proving it would be nearly impossible. Moret's influence extended beyond material matters. She was adept at shaping opinion among the sisters. A whispered observation here, a private remark there, often caused two nuns to disagree about scheduling or shared tasks. She played these minor rivalries carefully, never appearing overtly involved. It was as though she had learned the art of invisibility within an environment of strict observation. Her actions created friction without overt conflict, a skill that would be described centuries later as cunning and manipulative. Despite this, she was not cruel. Some of her interventions helped others, though indirectly. For example, she might leave an extra portion of bread or a herb hidden for a sister struggling with fatigue or illness. This generosity was small, discreet, and rarely acknowledged, but it cemented her influence. Sisters who benefited may have believed they had received a blessing from the abbey's routines, rather than noticing her hand in the act. The tension escalated one spring morning, when Moret tampered with the kitchen's water supply, rerouting it slightly, so that it would not reach certain areas until she needed it herself. The shift caused confusion, delaying the preparation of meals. For the first time, the abbess recognized the potential for significant disruption. While no harm was done, the incident revealed that Moret's small actions could cascade into larger consequences if left unchecked. It is during this period that you begin to understand why historians have labeled her the worst nun in history. She was not violent or openly defiant. She did not seek fame or wealth. Her influence was subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent and strategic. Every act, from minor theft to subtle manipulation of schedules, demonstrated a keen understanding of her environment and the weaknesses of those around her. The abbess respected her intelligence, but also feared it. And yet, in these months, a question began to form: what drove Moret? Was it boredom with the cloistered life, a desire for control in a world that demanded obedience, or a deeper psychological need, something the chroniclers could not fully capture? The historical record gives hints, but no certainty. You are left to consider whether her cleverness was born from malice, necessity, or simple human curiosity, the kind of curiosity that leads someone to push boundaries in a carefully ordered world. By the end of this second section, St. Clarissa's Abbey is no longer a simple backdrop of prayer and labor. It has become a stage for subtle human dynamics, where one clever nun quietly shapes the lives of her sisters, while remaining largely undetected. Every meal, every chore, every whispered exchange carries the potential for influence. You are left wondering, if her actions were largely invisible, how would the abbey eventually respond when her cumulative schemes could no longer be ignored? By the time summer approached at St. Clarissa's Abbey, Sister Moret's subtle manipulations could no longer be ignored. You can imagine the monastery, once calm and orderly, now carrying a quiet tension in every corridor. The nuns moved through their routines with care, wary of the small disruptions that had accumulated over months. Though no open confrontation had occurred, the pattern of mischief and control was increasingly apparent to Mother Beatrice, the abbess, whose patience had been tested in ways she had never anticipated. The turning point came unexpectedly. A visiting cleric arrived from a nearby abbey to inspect the scriptorium and review the abbey's records. His task was routine, but his meticulous attention to detail uncovered discrepancies that had gone unnoticed. Pages were out of order, certain herbs were unaccounted for, and food portions recorded in the storeroom logs did not match actual supplies. The cleric raised questions, and the nuns were questioned individually. Many hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. Some blamed oversights or novices, but inconsistencies persisted. Sister Moret, as always, presented herself as calm, respectful, and compliant. She claimed ignorance and offered explanations that seemed plausible. Her demeanor, gentle and composed, was convincing enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Yet the observant cleric, noting patterns in the minor deviations, began to connect subtle dots. The cumulative nature of small misdeeds pointed in one direction. Moret's name arose quietly among other nuns, though not openly. Mother Beatrice, who had long suspected Moret's cleverness, now faced the challenge of addressing a nun whose skill at evasion was remarkable. She did not wish to punish without cause, for Moret was otherwise diligent and maintained the outward appearance of devotion. Still, the abbess knew that unchecked mischief could erode the discipline and morale of the entire abbey. She decided to confront Moret directly, seeking a resolution that balanced correction with understanding. The confrontation took place in the abbess's private chamber. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Moret knelt, her hands folded, eyes lowered. Mother Beatrice spoke quietly but firmly, detailing the discrepancies noted in the scriptorium and storeroom. She emphasized the importance of honesty, obedience, and communal trust. The weight of her words was deliberate, and you can imagine the tension in the room as Moret absorbed them. At first, Moret remained silent, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she spoke. She admitted some actions, explaining them as attempts to manage her duties in a way that suited her understanding of the abbey's needs. She described moments when she had provided extra provisions to sisters struggling with illness or fatigue, subtly redirecting resources to support others. Her account was calm, reasoned, and surprisingly candid. She did not seek to justify all her misdeeds, but she framed many as acts of careful judgment, not malice. Mother Beatrice listened, weighing each word. The decision before her was delicate. She could punish Moret harshly, risking rebellion or demoralization among the other nuns, or she could accept the partial truth, imposing a measured response that preserved discipline without crushing intelligence or initiative. In the end, she chose balance. Moret was assigned additional duties, particularly in mentoring novices and assisting with meticulous tasks in the scriptorium. She was also required to account for her work more transparently and maintain closer oversight of resources. For Moret, this outcome was both a reprimand and a recognition. Though her cleverness had been challenged, her intelligence and subtle understanding of the abbey's workings were acknowledged. She continued her life as a nun, still capable of minor mischief, yet operating within boundaries that were now clearly defined. The abbey returned to a quieter routine, though the lessons of her subtle influence remained ingrained in the sisters' minds. Historians have long been fascinated by Sister Moret, not for dramatic exploits or scandalous transgressions, but for the quiet, persistent way she shaped her environment. Her story illustrates that even in the most rigid and disciplined communities, human ingenuity, curiosity, and subtle rebellion can create ripples far beyond what seems possible. She reminds you that history is not always recorded in grand events or battles, but in small, almost invisible acts of personality and agency. And so, as the monastery settled into its evening quiet, with candles burning low and shadows stretching across stone floors, you might reflect on this paradox. One nun, living under vows of obedience and contemplation, managed to influence the rhythm of an entire abbey through careful observation, intelligence, and small acts of subtle disruption. You are left with the thought that lingers quietly like a candle sip's final glow. How many ordinary lives, constrained by strict rules and expectations, leave traces of cleverness, defiance, or individuality that history may barely notice, yet profoundly shape the communities they inhabit? You now step away from cloistered monasteries and into the rugged landscape of medieval towns, where stone and timber were meant to carry not just people, but the weight of entire communities. In the early 13th century, in a small settlement along a twisting river valley, a bridge became the center of attention, not for its engineering brilliance, nor for the artistry of its arches, but for its catastrophic failure and the subtle lessons it left behind about construction, human error, and communal dependence. The town, called Lindwich in the records, was modest in size, home to roughly 300 people. Its economy relied on trade of wool, timber, and grain, and the river that ran through it was both a lifeline and a danger. Ferries existed, but they were slow and weather-dependent, and the river often swelled unpredictably in the spring months. The townspeople long desired a permanent bridge to connect both sides, to facilitate trade, travel, and the safety of children and livestock alike. Construction began with great excitement. Town elders commissioned master masons from a nearby city, men known for building durable stone bridges. Records suggest that the project began in a spirit of optimism. Stone was quarried from a hillside 10 to 15 miles away. Timber was felled in nearby woods, shaped by skilled carpenters, and delivered with great effort. The foundation of the bridge was laid in the river itself, a challenge due to shifting currents, muddy riverbeds, and winter rains. The bridge was designed as a simple arch with 3 spans, sufficient to carry carts and pedestrians. Yet, already, subtle problems emerged. The mason in charge, Master Gervais, relied on estimates of the river's depth and force rather than precise measurement. Wooden scaffolds were placed quickly, and sometimes shifted when the river rose. Stones were laid carefully, yet at times mortar was mixed too thinly to withstand prolonged exposure to water. The townspeople did not notice these flaws immediately. To the naked eye, the bridge appeared solid, even impressive for its scale. You might picture the daily activity around the bridge as it neared completion. Townspeople carried food across it, children ran to and fro, merchants tested its surface with loaded carts. Birds perched on the stonework, and river water lapped against the piers in a soft, rhythmic manner. For months, it seemed sturdy, yet the quiet unease of those who observed subtle cracks, shifts in stone alignment, and small gaps in the mortar began to accumulate. Few spoke openly about it, fearing ridicule or distrusting their own judgment. After all, the masons had been trained, and masons were supposed to know better. The final weeks of construction were marked by tension. Winter rains swelled the river, flooding nearby fields. Townspeople watched nervously as water pressed against the unfinished piers. Master Gervais remained confident, but his assistants whispered about the pressure of the river and the loosened stones. Supplies were stretched thin, forcing compromises in mortar quality and scaffold reinforcement. Even small decisions, whether to allow wet mortar to set overnight or continue laying stones in a drizzle, carried weighty consequences. At last the bridge was complete enough to allow cautious crossing. Town elders celebrated with a modest feast, and merchants praised the ingenuity of the masons. Children ran over the arches, giggling, and unaware of the subtle imperfections beneath their feet. Yet, beneath the festive atmosphere, small fractures continued to form, stones shifted minutely under repeated load, mortar cracked in the presence of frost. The bridge seemed strong, yet carried hidden vulnerabilities that only time and circumstance would reveal. This is the world you now inhabit, a small town depending on stone and mortar, human judgment, and communal trust. The bridge, meant to unite and protect, was a delicate balance between ambition and reality. It promised connection, but concealed fragility. The townspeople moved with confidence, yet the river continued to flow, indifferent to human plans, its power only partially understood by those who built beside it. And you are left with a question that will guide the story into its next chapters. When a structure carries not only stones but the livelihood and safety of a community, how much can human foresight prevent disaster, and how much remains at the mercy of circumstance, error, and patience tested by time? As spring turned to summer in Lindwich, the bridge that had promised connection began to reveal its fragile nature. You can imagine the river swelling with seasonal rains, carrying debris downstream, lapping at the stone piers with a persistent insistence. At first the problems were almost imperceptible. Tiny fissures in mortar, a stone slightly out of alignment, a wooden scaffold straining under its own weight. But over time, these small issues grew, unnoticed by most but troubling to a few observant townspeople. Among those who watched closely was a miller named Thomas, whose watermill sat just downstream. He had relied on the bridge for transporting grain and timber. Each day, as he crossed or viewed it from the bank, he noticed subtle shifts. Stones seemed to settle differently than the day before. One arch appeared to lean slightly. When carts passed over it, a low creaking could sometimes be heard, almost drowned out by the river's roar. Thomas mentioned his concerns quietly to neighbors, but few took them seriously. The masons had declared the bridge complete, and townsfolk preferred to trust expertise rather than suspicion. The masons themselves were busy with other projects, leaving only minor assistants in the town. Master Gervais visited occasionally, confident that his work could withstand normal use. Yet even he noticed signs of strain. One morning, while inspecting the central arch, he observed hairline cracks in the mortar, where frost had expanded the joints. He instructed his assistants to reinforce key points with extra mortar and timber bracing, but supplies were limited, and these repairs were necessarily partial, focusing on visible weaknesses rather than addressing the underlying design flaws that would soon prove critical. Children continued to play on the bridge, laughing and running, while carts laden with wool and grain rolled cautiously across the arches. To the casual observer, the bridge seemed strong. Its stonework was impressive, and the arches held their elegant curve. But beneath the surface, small imbalances were accumulating. Water eroded the riverbed slightly around the piers, creating subtle pressure on the foundations. Repeated crossings of loaded carts caused minute shifts in stones. Each minor event alone seemed insignificant, yet together they built towards something inevitable. The townspeople began noticing small, worrying signs. A few remarked on a slight sway in the central span, especially after a heavy cart passed. Others saw small gaps forming in the joints, or heard the occasional low groan as the structure settled unevenly. Rumors spread quietly. Some feared the bridge might collapse. Others dismissed such talk as superstition. In a small town where gossip could travel faster than news, the uncertainty itself created tension. Merchants began timing their crossings carefully, avoiding the bridge during high water or when multiple carts might use it simultaneously. One evening, after a particularly heavy rain, Thomas observed that a pier near the eastern bank had shifted slightly, its base undermined by the swollen river. Stones were misaligned in a subtle but noticeable way, and the timbers supporting the roadway vibrated under the weight of a passing cart. He reported it immediately to the town elders. They convened a meeting to discuss the problem, summoning Gavaz and his assistants. The discussion was urgent but calm. Repair was advised, but it would require careful work and time, both in short supply. Supplies of timber and mortar were limited, and winter storms could strike again before the repairs were complete. Gervais surveyed the bridge with a furrowed brow. He acknowledged the concern but emphasized that the damage appeared manageable, yet even he felt unease. Unlike the other masons, he recognized that some stresses were internal, below the surface, invisible to casual inspection. The stones were settling in ways that could worsen under heavy load, and the river's unpredictable rise could amplify these pressures. He recommended restricting traffic, especially carts, and reinforcing the piers as soon as possible. The elders agreed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Farmers and merchants often crossed out of necessity, risking further strain on the fragile structure. In the following weeks, repairs were attempted. Some timber supports were replaced, cracks were patched with new mortar, and guards were stationed to monitor crossings. Yet the bridge's inherent weaknesses remained. The combination of design limitations, material fatigue, and human reliance on the structure created a tension that grew daily. Every cart, every pack horse, every footstep added to the invisible pressure. By midsummer, the bridge was a paradox, impressive to behold, yet quietly unstable. The townspeople continued to use it, reassured by its appearance, and by their need to cross. Yet beneath their confidence, a subtle anxiety persisted. Even those who had once ignored the early signs began to wonder whether the bridge could truly bear the load it was expected to carry. And here you are, watching a structure that seems permanent, yet carries the seeds of its own failure. The river flows indifferently beneath it. The stones groan softly under repeated weight, and human judgment struggles to anticipate the consequences of subtle imperfections. You are left with a question hanging in the humid summer air. When ordinary materials, human ambition and environmental forces collide, how long can a community ignore the warning signs before disaster strikes? By late summer, the tension that had quietly grown around Lindwich's bridge reached its inevitable conclusion. You can picture the town along the river, bustling with carts carrying grain, wool, and timber, children chasing one another across the narrow streets, and merchants haggling loudly at the marketplace. All of this activity depended on the bridge, the very structure that now carried hidden weaknesses, threatening to unravel everything. The day of the collapse began like any other, though the river was swollen from a recent week of heavy rain. The current pushed against the stone piers, water frothing around the bases, and debris from upstream pressed against the arches with a slow, grinding insistence. Townspeople crossed as usual, some with carts, some on foot. The bridge creaked under weight, but outwardly, it still appeared strong. Yet beneath the surface, the mortar had loosened. A key arch had shifted minutely, and one of the central piers rested on soil partially washed away by the relentless river. A loaded cart reached the central span just as a group of children ran ahead of it. The weight, combined with subtle shifts already occurring, caused a small crack to propagate across the keystone of the arch. At first it was a whisper, a sound almost drowned out by the river, but within moments, the stones loosened further, tilting and settling unevenly. The timbers of the roadway groaned, some snapping under tension. Panic spread. The cart jolted and tipped as the arch began to sag. Children screamed and ran back towards safety, while farmers and merchants scrambled to the banks. The collapse happened in stages. One side of the central arch gave way first, plunging stones and timber into the rushing water below. Water surged through the gap, accelerating erosion at the other piers. The roadway twisted, sending carts and goods tumbling into the river. A group of livestock, startled, bolted toward the banks. The bridge's failure was neither instantaneous nor silent. It was a slow, creeping disaster, giving witnesses the horrifying clarity of seeing something solid become unsteady and then vanish. Remarkably, no lives were lost that day, though there were injuries. Several townspeople suffered bruises and broken limbs from falls or from the collapsing timber. Carts and cargo were lost entirely. The river carried away portions of the bridge's structure, leaving only remnants of the arches on either bank. For the people of Lindwich it was both a practical catastrophe and a profound shock. A structure they had trusted, relied upon for months, had proven incapable of withstanding the natural forces and the repeated human load placed upon it. After the collapse, the town elders convened immediately. The community faced not only the challenge of replacing the bridge, but also the urgent need to restore trust in public works. Merchants worried about lost goods and missed trade, while families feared for safe crossings in the future. Master gavars, the masons and local craftsmen were summoned to assess whether reconstruction was possible, and if so, how it could be done differently. The lessons of the collapse were recorded meticulously, both by chroniclers and by town records. Several factors were noted. The foundation had been insufficiently secured against seasonal flooding, the mortar had degraded faster than expected due to wet conditions, and repeated overloading had accelerated the failure. Even minor oversights, combined with environmental forces, had compounded into a structural catastrophe. The bridge itself, intended to unify and support the town, became a vivid reminder of the limits of human skill when pitted against both nature and imperfect planning. In the years that followed, a new bridge was eventually constructed, with deeper foundations, improved arches, and reinforced supports. Yet the memory of the original failure lingered in the town's collective consciousness. Parents warned children to be cautious, merchants recounted the collapse to newcomers, and masons from nearby regions studied the event as a cautionary tale. It became a quiet, persistent example of how small errors and unchecked assumptions can accumulate into something catastrophic. The story of Lindwich's bridge is not one of negligence alone, nor of disaster without context. It illustrates the interplay of ambition, material limitations, and environmental forces. A community's survival often depends as much on careful observation, respect for natural forces, and humility in planning as on skill or craftsmanship. It also reminds you, the listener, that history is built not only from grand victories or spectacular tragedies, but from the slow, often unnoticed consequences of everyday decisions. As you imagine the river flowing past the broken piers, carrying fragments of stone and timber downstream, one question remains for reflection. How many structures, plans, or ambitions throughout history have quietly carried the seeds of their own failure, only revealed when the weight of time, nature, or circumstance became too great to bear? Now you move from the rural riverside to the grand yet precarious world of medieval banquets, where the display of wealth and power often hid dangers as subtle as they were deadly. In the mid-14th century, in a castle perched atop a rocky hill, an event occurred that historians would later label the Poisoned Feast, not for its drama or massacre, but for the quiet unraveling of trust, the hidden motives of nobles, and the ways small choices could ripple across a household. The castle itself was modest compared to the great fortresses of kings, but it projected authority over the surrounding valley. Its halls were stone-arched, with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and ancestral victories. The kitchens bustled with cooks, servants, and apprentices, all working long hours to prepare meals that would impress visiting nobles and reassure the castle's lord of his own prestige. The larder was stocked with salted meats, fresh breads, imported spices, and rare delicacies that only appeared for special occasions. It was in this environment that Lady Isolde, the castle's mistress, planned a feast for visiting barons from neighboring regions. The intention was to celebrate a political alliance, but also to subtly assert dominance in subtle gestures, choice seating, the arrangement of dishes, the presentation of wine in fine vessels. The feast would last from late afternoon until after dusk, with courses served in a carefully choreographed order, each plate carrying social as well as culinary significance. Among those invited was Sir Reynold, a minor lord whose ambitions exceeded his station. Historical records suggest he had been passed over for a council position in favor of a more favored noble, and carried a quiet grudge against Lady Isolde and her husband. He observed the preparation of the feast with interest, noting which dishes were prized and which servants handled them. To you, the listener, it is important to recognize that in medieval households, access to food and drink was not merely sustenance, it was leverage, a medium for influence, and at times a vehicle for harm. The kitchen staff prepared the banquet meticulously. Spiced meats were roasted over open flames, pies were filled with rich mixtures of meats and fruits, and wine was decanted from large barrels into silver goblets. The servants were trained to avoid mistakes, but small oversights were inevitable. A spice misplaced, a dish left to cool too long, a servant distracted by conversation with another. Each minor lapse in combination with human intent could have consequences far beyond what anyone might imagine. During the feast, Lady Isolde observed her guests carefully. Seating arrangements were deliberate. Those she favored were placed near the head table, while potential rivals occupied less advantageous positions. Conversation flowed politely at first, the hum of polite laughter and clinking goblets filling the hall. Servants moved discreetly among the tables, offering fresh wine, slicing meat, and replenishing bread. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Sir Reynold, positioned near the periphery, watched for opportunity. He had reason to believe that small interventions could sway outcomes, and the complexity of the banquet, with its multiple courses and numerous servants, offered ample room for subtle manipulation. Historical accounts indicate that the first hints of danger were almost imperceptible. A servant accidentally spilled a small amount of wine on the edge of Sir Reynold's goblet, which he dismissed. Another dish, intended for a favored guest, was briefly unattended while a kitchen apprentice fetched additional ingredients. Such minor lapses would later be scrutinized in chronicles of the event, but at the time they passed unnoticed by most. By mid-evening, the feast reached its main course, roasted boar with spiced sauces, accompanied by bread, vegetables and wine from several barrels. Guests ate heartily, unaware of any imminent threat. It is in these moments, as history has taught us, that ordinary human behaviors, curiosity, distraction, ambition, intersected with vulnerability. Sir Reynold moved quietly, speaking to a servant, observing the flow of dishes, and noting which wines were poured into which goblets. The subtlety of his actions, combined with the chaotic environment of the kitchen and dining hall, set the stage for what would become a quiet crisis, one that tested the vigilance and judgment of all involved. By the end of the evening the guests were satisfied, conversations had wound down, and the servants began clearing dishes. But you, listening closely, sense that something has shifted. A small error, a moment of oversight, or an intentional act, its source unclear, has been introduced into the complex machinery of the banquet. As you imagine the castle sip's grand hall, flickering candlelight on stone walls, silverware gleaming on wooden tables, and the hum of conversation fading, you are left with a quiet question that will guide the next section. In an environment built on careful observation, etiquette, and hierarchy, how could a single unnoticed act disrupt the trust, health, and lives of everyone present, leaving consequences that would ripple long after the feast concluded? As the evening progressed at Lady Isolde's castle, the quiet rhythms of the feast masked an invisible tension. You can picture the grand hall, tapestries dimly illuminated by candlelight, the scent of roasting meats mingling with spilled wine and warm bread. Guests laughed politely, engaged in careful conversation, yet the stage was set for an incident that would reveal both the fragility of human health and the delicacy of trust in medieval households. Sir Reynold, who had observed the preparations with meticulous attention, now began his subtle interventions. Historical records are frustratingly vague, as one might expect for a crime committed quietly and carefully, but it appears he found opportunity in small oversights. A servant distracted while decanting wine, a dish briefly unattended, a spice or herb mislaid in haste. You can imagine how easy it would have been in a bustling medieval kitchen to introduce something unusual without attracting attention. The chaos of multiple courses, the hum of conversation, and the dim lighting created perfect conditions for unnoticed action. The first signs of trouble were subtle. A favored guest complained of a faint bitterness in their wine, dismissed at first as a quirk of taste. Another guest remarked on an unusual texture in a small pastry, which was brushed aside by polite acknowledgement. Only in hindsight do these minor observations appear as hints of a more serious problem. The chroniclers, writing years later, struggle to reconstruct the exact sequence, noting only that unease spread quietly across the table. Meanwhile, Lady Isolde remained attentive. She was accustomed to the dynamics of a banquet, and the occasional mishap, spilled wine, minor culinary mistakes, or nervous servants. Yet even she could not anticipate the careful orchestration of Sir Reynold's plan. Small portions were manipulated, perhaps a pinch of herb here, a few drops of liquid there, nothing overt, nothing traceable at the moment, yet cumulatively it began to affect those who consumed it. By the later courses, discomfort became noticeable. Guests shifted in their seats, faces pale or flushed, lips pressed together. Some excused themselves discreetly, attributing nausea to overeating or the richness of the food. Others remained, masking unease behind forced smiles, fearing embarrassment or social consequences. The servants, unaware of any intentional tampering, continued their duties, moving between tables, clearing dishes, and replenishing wine, oblivious to the subtle danger they were unwittingly facilitating. What makes this event remarkable is its quiet unfolding. There was no dramatic shouting, no visible violence. Instead, it was a slow, creeping realization. One by one, individuals began to experience the consequences of the unnoticed act. In a medieval setting, without modern medicine or diagnostic tools, even minor poisoning could be alarming, confusing, and potentially fatal. Chroniclers later noted that the symptoms, mild nausea, dizziness, and fatigue, spread across the table in a pattern that suggested design, but contemporary witnesses were left with uncertainty. The psychological dimension was as significant as the physical. Guests, uncertain of what was causing discomfort, began to question one another. Trust, so central to the social hierarchy of the banquet, began to erode. Whispered suspicions circulated quietly. Had a rival noble tampered with the food? Was there a curse, a joke, or an accident? Lady Isolde's authority was challenged, not through confrontation, but through the subtle unease her guests now felt. What had been a celebration of alliances and hierarchy was now tinged with quiet fear and uncertainty. Even Sir Reynold had to act cautiously. He could not reveal his own involvement, and yet he observed the effects of his interventions with satisfaction, noting the growing tension and the slow erosion of trust. The chaos remained invisible to most, yet the consequences were tangible: unease among guests, whispers that would eventually circulate beyond the castle walls, and an imprint of caution in the minds of those present. By the end of the night, the feast concluded under a shadow of subtle disruption. Guests departed with polite farewells, yet the experience lingered in memory. Some fell ill more seriously in the days following. Others recounted the taste, the discomfort, the inexplicable dizziness. Historians later inferred that Sir Reynold's quiet acts of sabotage had been remarkably effective, not through overt violence, but through careful observation, patience, and exploitation of small lapses in human oversight. And now, as you imagine the emptying hall, candlelight flickering off cold stone walls, tables cleared of dishes, and the soft murmurs of departing guests echoing in corridors, you are left with a question that shadows the night. In a world without modern safeguards, how many small, almost invisible acts, driven by ambition, resentment, or curiosity, have quietly shaped outcomes, leaving consequences felt long after the event itself has passed? The morning after the banquet at Lady Isolde's castle brought a quiet reckoning. You can imagine the castle's halls, now empty of visiting nobles, filled instead with anxious servants, worried family members, and whispers about the strange discomforts experienced the night before. What had seemed a routine feast was now a subject of scrutiny, not for its elegance or generosity, but for the subtle harm that had been quietly inflicted. Symptoms persisted among several guests: nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. Some dismissed it as overindulgence or the richness of the feast, while others became seriously ill, their pallor and weakness unmistakable. The absence of medical knowledge capable of identifying the cause only heightened the uncertainty. A few of the castle's own physicians and apothecaries examined the guests and provided herbs and remedies, but they could not determine whether the illness was accidental, natural, or the result of intentional tampering. Lady Isolde herself faced a delicate challenge. As hostess, her authority and reputation were intertwined with the success of the feast, yet she could not ignore the growing unease. Servants were questioned, the kitchens inspected, barrels of wine and containers of food scrutinized. No definitive proof emerged, and the subtlety of the act meant that the true source of the discomfort remained invisible. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate beyond the castle walls, reaching neighboring lords and nobles. Some suggested malice, others mere accident, and each interpretation reflected the social anxieties of the time. Sir Reynold, whose quiet interventions had set this chain of events in motion, maintained a careful distance. He neither claimed responsibility nor drew attention to himself. Instead, he observed the impact of his actions, satisfied that the ripple effect of unease, mistrust, and subtle illness had undermined the perception of stability at Lady Isolde's household. In a period when social perception and reputation were paramount, even minor disturbances carried profound consequences. Over the following weeks, the castle returned to a semblance of normality, though vigilance remained heightened. Kitchen staff became more disciplined, guests more cautious, and Lady Isolde herself instituted stricter oversight of meals and wine. Chroniclers later noted that the event left an enduring impression on protocols for noble feasts, more careful scrutiny of ingredients, greater attention to who handled food, and heightened awareness of subtle manipulations. The poisoned feast became a quiet lesson in the importance of diligence, observation, and the potential for human ambition to exploit gaps in routine. What makes this episode remarkable is that there was no grand trial, no dramatic confrontation, no decisive punishment. The consequences were psychological, social, and subtle, rather than spectacularly violent. Trust, once quietly eroded, took months to restore. Guests returned cautiously. Alliances were re-examined, and a pervasive awareness lingered that even in a controlled environment, human intent and oversight, or the lack thereof, could produce outcomes far beyond immediate perception. From a modern perspective, the poisoned feast illustrates several timeless truths. First, the smallest human actions can produce disproportionately large effects when circumstances align. Second, environments structured for order, such as a banquet or a monastery, can be vulnerable to subtle disruptions if vigilance lapses. And third, human ambition, curiosity, or resentment often manifests in quiet, almost invisible ways, leaving a legacy not of headlines or dramatic confrontation, but of slow, creeping influence. As you imagine the empty banquet hall, the polished tables, lingering scents of roast meats and spiced wine, flickering candlelight casting long shadows on stone walls, you are left reflecting on the delicate interplay of human behavior, trust, and consequence. One small act, almost imperceptible at the time, reshaped perceptions, behaviors, and social dynamics in a way that would ripple far beyond that single night. And so, you are left with a final reflection for this story. How many events in history have been quietly shaped by subtle manipulations, minor oversights, or unnoticed acts, leaving consequences that reverberate long after the actors have disappeared from the record? Now, you enter the world of medieval commerce, where guilds governed trades, regulated apprenticeships, and maintained meticulous records so critical that losing one could destabilize an entire community. In the bustling city of Ashbourne, in the late 14th century, a seemingly ordinary misplacement of a ledger became a quiet disaster, revealing not dramatic battles or intrigues, but the subtle vulnerabilities of economic systems and human oversight. Ashbourne was a thriving center for cloth and leather production, its streets lined with timber-framed shops and workshops. Smoke from kilns and forges mingled with the scent of tanned hides and damp wool. Merchants shouted prices in the market square, apprentices ran errands and delivered parcels, and the city's wealth and reputation relied heavily on the meticulous record-keeping of its guilds. Each trade, cloth, shoemaking, tanning, and metalwork, kept a ledger that documented apprentices, dues, debts, and transactions. Accuracy was vital. A misplaced entry could delay payment, cause disputes, or even ruin reputations. The Guild of Weavers, one of Ashbourne's oldest and most respected organizations, maintained its records in a small chamber above the main workshop. The ledgers, bound in leather and carefully inscribed with ink, were the backbone of the guild's authority. Master weavers and clerks relied on these documents to track apprentices' progress, ensure proper payment to suppliers, and maintain order within the trade. To the casual observer, these books might seem mundane, but their contents shaped the economic and social lives of hundreds of people. It was in this environment that a curious event occurred. The ledger for a single quarter went missing. Historical records suggest it was misplaced during a routine audit, perhaps carried into the workshop by a distracted clerk or left on a table where apprentices had been working. The disappearance went unnoticed initially. The guild continued its daily operations, unaware that the critical record for wages, deliveries, and apprenticeships was absent. The consequences, however, were immediate and cascading. Without the ledger, payments could not be verified. Apprentices argued with masters over days worked, suppliers demanded proof of delivery, and disputes over dues escalated. What began as a minor oversight became a source of tension within the guild, affecting relationships not only within the workshop but also in the wider commercial network of Ashbourne. Merchants who depended on the guild's stability found themselves delayed in trade, uncertain whether transactions were valid or debts settled. Master weavers attempted to reconstruct the ledger from memory and partial notes, but human memory is fallible, especially when recording complex financial transactions and apprentices' work histories. Mistakes accumulated. Some apprentices received more than they were owed, while others were underpaid. Suppliers were misinformed, resulting in delays and minor conflicts. Each error, while small individually, combined to create a state of low-level disorder that threatened the smooth functioning of the guild. The story of the lost ledger is remarkable, not for dramatic theft or sabotage, but for the quiet ways in which ordinary human error could ripple outward. In an era before standardized bookkeeping, electronic records, or even widespread literacy, a single misplaced book could undermine trust, productivity, and social harmony. The guild, dependent on precise documentation, found itself vulnerable to something as mundane as forgetfulness or distraction. By the end of this section, you can imagine the guild chamber filled with anxious clerks, apprentices consulting memory and scraps of paper, and masters cross-referencing old receipts in an effort to restore order. The city outside continued its rhythm of trade, seemingly unaffected, yet within the walls of the guild, a minor oversight had magnified into a problem that demanded attention, careful observation, and patience. And now, you are left with a quiet question that will carry forward into the next section. When systems are built on meticulous human oversight, how fragile is the structure when one small error occurs, and what subtle consequences might ripple outward before anyone realizes the scope of the problem? As days passed in Ashbourne, the consequences of the missing guild ledger began to expand beyond the walls of the workshop. You can picture the guild of weavers, its chamber filled with anxious scribes and apprentices, poring over scraps of paper, memorized accounts, and hastily jotted notes, attempting to reconstruct a record that had once been complete and precise. Each attempt revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and small errors, tiny miscalculations that compounded over time, creating tension within the guild and confusion throughout the city. The apprentices were the first to notice the discrepancies. A young boy named Eamon had been apprenticed for nearly a year, learning the intricacies of weaving fine wool. Without the ledger, his progress could not be verified. He presented samples of his work and recited days of labor, but the masters could not confirm whether he had completed the full term of duties required for advancement. Similarly, another apprentice, Marjorie, argued that she had delivered cloth to several merchants, yet without documented records, she faced delays in payment. The fairness and order of apprenticeship, a cornerstone of guild operations, was now under subtle strain. Suppliers, too, felt the effects. Merchants who had delivered raw materials to the workshop could not verify that they had been compensated. Some payments were duplicated by mistake, while others were overlooked entirely. Arguments arose over debts, creating tension that occasionally spilled into the marketplace. Townspeople who had previously trusted the guild's efficiency began questioning its reliability. A guild built on meticulous record-keeping, reputation and precision was now vulnerable, not to theft or malice, but to the quiet chaos of human error magnified by dependence on a single missing ledger. The master weavers attempted to address the situation with methodical effort. They held daily meetings to cross-reference receipts, note deliveries, and verify apprentices' work. Each correction led to small improvements, yet errors persisted. A minor miscalculation of wool delivered to a merchant might seem trivial, but when multiplied across multiple transactions, it created confusion and frustration. The process demanded patience, diligence, and keen observation, qualities that were not uniformly present among all apprentices or clerks. The ripple extended further still. Merchants dependent on timely deliveries found themselves delaying shipments to other towns, creating bottlenecks in trade. Artisans who relied on consistent access to raw materials had to adjust production schedules. Even the local taverns where guild members gathered after work buzzed with discussion and complaints. A seemingly small administrative oversight, the lost ledger was subtly reshaping daily life in Ashbourne, illustrating how interconnected human systems could be, even in a medieval city. Yet the situation was not entirely negative. The guild's efforts to reconstruct the ledger encouraged careful observation, collaboration, and the development of informal checks among apprentices and clerks. Eamon and Marjorie, along with other diligent apprentices, became skilled at memory-based accounting, cross-checking deliveries and payments against physical evidence of transactions. These adaptations, born from necessity, strengthened the guild in unexpected ways. A crisis born of a minor mistake revealed resilience, ingenuity, and the capacity of ordinary people to respond to unforeseen challenges. By the end of this second section, the ledger had still not been fully recovered, but the guild was learning to cope with its absence. Errors continued to surface, yet the collaborative effort to reconstruct the records fostered a new awareness of the importance of diligence, oversight, and communication. The town outside seemed oblivious to the quiet turmoil within the guild chamber, but the subtle consequences of the missing ledger were clear to those directly involved. And now, you are left with a question that lingers in the air above the bustling city streets of Ashbourne. When an essential system is disrupted by a single missing record, how much of the resulting confusion and disorder is inevitable, and how much can careful observation, patience, and collaboration restore without ever fully recovering what was lost? Eventually, after weeks of painstaking effort, the Guild of Weavers in Ashbourne began to piece together the missing ledger, or at least enough of it to restore functional order. You can imagine the guild chamber, scattered with scraps of paper, ink-stained hands of clerks and apprentices, and the constant murmur of recitations, as Eamon, Marjorie, and other apprentices worked to reconstruct days of transactions from memory, receipts, and personal recollections. What had begun as a seemingly minor oversight now demanded the attention of the entire guild, illustrating how fragile systems reliant on human diligence could be. The ledger itself was never found in its original form, nor was it clear whether it had been misplaced, borrowed, or temporarily taken by an absent-minded clerk. Historical accounts suggest that the mystery of its disappearance was never solved, and the original document may have been lost permanently. Yet by carefully cross-referencing surviving notes, receipts, and first-hand accounts, the guild was able to re-establish records of apprentices' work, supplier payments, and outstanding debts. Mistakes persisted, and minor disputes continued, but the overall system was restored sufficiently to resume normal operations. The recovery process revealed much about human resilience and adaptation. Apprentices became more vigilant, keeping their own private records to complement official logs. Clerks instituted daily check-ins, ensuring that each transaction was verified as it occurred. Masters learned the value of redundancy, encouraging multiple forms of documentation, rather than relying solely on a single ledger. These adaptations, born out of necessity, strengthened the guild's operational integrity in ways that might not have been considered if the ledger had never been lost. Yet the incident also left subtle scars. Trust, once disrupted, required time to rebuild. Apprentices who had been underpaid, or whose progress had been questioned, were understandably wary. Merchants and suppliers became more cautious in their dealings, demanding confirmation in writing and insisting on immediate verification of deliveries and payments. The guild's reputation, though ultimately restored, carried a lingering awareness of vulnerability, how easily oversight or human error could ripple outward to affect not just internal operations, but the broader community and economy. In the larger scope of Ashbourne's history, the lost ledger was a quiet yet significant event. It was not a battle, a revolt, or a dramatic scandal. Instead, it was a slow, creeping disruption, magnified by the dependence of a community on meticulous human organization. Chroniclers later highlighted it as a lesson in diligence, accountability, and the interconnectedness of human systems. It demonstrated that even in the most seemingly mundane affairs, counting wool, tracking apprentices, recording debts, attention to detail, patience, and collaboration were essential for communal stability. As the guild resumed normal operations, you might imagine the city streets bustling once more, merchants haggling, apprentices running errands, artisans crafting goods, and families navigating daily life. Yet behind this ordinary rhythm was the quiet awareness of fragility, the memory of how a missing book had nearly disrupted an entire trade network. The story of the lost ledger reminds you that history is often shaped not by grand battles or spectacular events, but by subtle lapses, human diligence, and the ingenuity required to restore order after disruption. And so you are left with a reflection as you consider this unremarkable yet consequential episode. How many systems, communities, or networks throughout history have quietly teetered on the edge of disorder due to minor oversights, only to be saved or transformed by careful observation, patience, and the unheralded diligence of ordinary people?